If you love great stories, you've come to the right place. Subscribe to my channel to make sure you don't miss any new videos. Like and share this video with your friends if you enjoyed it, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Wednesday, you won't believe what Thing did today, Enid said through laughter, bouncing into the room with cheerful steps and slightly tousled hair. The Addams family's hand was perched on her shoulder like a lifelong pet. I don't care what Thing did, Wednesday said, her voice as dry as ever. Thing froze in place, clearly offended. Though used to his mistress by now, he just knocked on the table with his knuckles, like a silent huff. Enid smiled with one eyebrow raised. Woke up in a bad mood, or is that your new default setting? Because you've been worse than usual since this morning. Wednesday didn't reply. Instead, she turned to Thing with a firm expression. Leave. Thing pointed at her, then at Enid, then at himself in a kind of what did I do? Wander around the school, Wednesday continued, unbothered. Observe, listen. I want a report before midnight on suspicious conversations. Surnames, first names, allegiances, you know the drill. The hand hesitated, almost refusing. But something in Wednesday's black eyes and her tense stillness made things shrink slightly. And he left. Before Enid could ask what was going on, Wednesday spoke. I need to talk to you. Her tone wasn't harsh, it was precise, too much so. Enid straightened up. That's serious. Another crazy cultist, or some sighting of a dangerous spellman? Enid asked, ready to jump into action if needed. None of that. Sit down, Wednesday said, gesturing subtly toward a pink chair. Enid obeyed, calmer now but more curious than ever. Her eyes studied her friend's posture. Yes, she considered Wednesday a friend. Their friendship had resumed and grown stronger thanks to the missions they'd done together. Wednesday walked to her desk, but didn't sit down. She just leaned slightly forward on it, her dark eyes fixed on Enid's. A few seconds passed in silence. Are you going to tell me what this is about? You're kind of scaring me, Enid said, shifting a little in her seat. Wednesday took a deep, silent breath. Internally, she sighed. I've been researching werewolf mates. Enid blinked. What? I've been reading, Wednesday continued without emotion, specifically about the emotional biology of your kind, fated pairs, the unbreakable bond, the concept of a mate. Enid tensed instantly. Her back straightened, her jaw clenched. Why do you want to talk about that? Wednesday didn't hesitate. Because I think your mate is Luke. Enid didn't deny it. She lowered her gaze a little, but then held Wednesday's eyes. I think it's pretty obvious, and you know I'm not going after him. I proved that. You shouldn't be so distrustful after everything we've been through. I thought there was trust. Pause. Besides, Luke clearly doesn't feel the same. He only has eyes for you. Wednesday shook her head once slowly. That's not what I mean. She straightened up, no longer leaning on the desk. I mean how dangerous that bond can be when the love isn't mutual, a one-sided connection, fixed, biologically predestined, like an open wound that won't close. Enid pressed her lips together. I know, she replied without hesitation. That's why I stopped chasing him. I stopped listening in on your video calls. Her voice dropped a bit, more serious, and I'd already made up my mind. Once all this is over, I was going to cut all ties. Not out of hate, but for my mental health, for self-preservation. Wednesday nodded, just once, and for that you'll have to stop seeing me too. Enid opened her mouth, but didn't respond right away. I'm his girlfriend. Seeing me would be like a constant reminder of what you lost, of what you can't have. Am I wrong? Wednesday added. No, you're right. I'd thought about that too, Enid said, swallowing hard. And she looked down. Not because I don't want to be your friend, but because seeing you will hurt, even if I don't want it to. There was a brief, heavy silence. Still, even if you stop seeing him, even if you try to forget, the bond will still be there, Wednesday added, her words softer but no less sharp. You're already too connected to him, obsessed, and it'll be dangerous for you. Enid looked up slightly, her eyes filled with pain, but she didn't interrupt. And you'll lose your bond with me too. Your friendship with me will break again. And knowing how emotional you are, that will hurt you too. Enid exhaled slowly, closed her eyes for a second. I know, she whispered. Then with a hint of frustration, she opened her eyes again. I know. But why are you telling me all this? Do you have some kind of suggestion? She asked, her tone just barely exasperated. Since when had Wednesday Addams turned into some sort of emotional therapist? What was this, an intervention? Was she trying to make sure Enid wouldn't jump out a window once the war was over? Just thinking about it irritated her. Yes, they were friends. Yes, they trusted each other. But Wednesday wasn't exactly the queen of affection. Her way of caring was unique and weird. Like analyzing emotions was a logical equation, not a minefield of crossfire. Yes, I do have a suggestion, said Wednesday. Oh, really? Enlighten me, doctor, Enid snapped, crossing her arms in defensive sarcasm, bracing for whatever ridiculous thing Wednesday would say now. Wednesday didn't hesitate. Polygamy, 13. The silence that followed was so thick, it seemed to suck the air out of the room. Enid stared at her, right in the eyes, looking for any hint of sarcasm, some cruel joke, a bizarre social experiment, but she found nothing. Wednesday was completely serious. Polygamy, Enid repeated in a low, stammering voice. This was the last response she ever expected. Yes, Wednesday nodded. I'm willing to share Luke with you, if you're willing to accept it too. Then, with absolute nonchalance, she sat at her desk, picked up a small textbook without even opening it, and added, Take your time to consider it. Enid froze, literally, her eyes locked, her brain in suspension, like the world had forgotten to load the next frame. Several seconds passed. Then suddenly, she shot up from the chair as if someone had shoved her. Polygamy, she repeated, this time louder. Wednesday turned to look at her, unfazed. Which part wasn't clear? Enid opened her mouth, then closed it, opened it again. The part where my best friend suggests we share her boyfriend. And you are even more obsessed with Luke than I am, she blurted, flailing a hand as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Wednesday didn't respond immediately. She just thought, my best friend. Enid had said it naturally, without much thought. For someone like Enid, extroverted with dozens of acquaintances, saying best friend had to carry weight. For Wednesday, it wasn't just that Enid was her best friend. She was her only friend. And as for the accusation of obsession, she couldn't deny that part. In fact, it brought her a certain satisfaction. She had won. And she liked winning, especially when it came to Luke. I'm not suggesting this out of generosity or guilt, Wednesday finally said, setting the book aside and standing up. I'm suggesting it because I'm worried about you. Enid opened her mouth again, ready to snap back, but Wednesday raised a hand with authority. I know what a mate means to a werewolf. I know that even if you don't pursue him, even if you walk away, you'll keep loving him. And that can destroy you, no matter what you tell yourself. And I don't want that to happen because... Wednesday swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional weight of her words. Because you're my best friend, and I don't want to lose you after all this is over. Enid looked at her, surprised. Wednesday had just said more emotional things in the last minute than Enid ever thought she would hear from her. That's why I'm offering this, Wednesday continued, her tone steady. Accept it or don't. It's your decision. If you accept, we move to the next step. If you say no, then you deal with it when the war ends, we cut ties, and if you end up offing yourself, it's no longer my concern. Enid couldn't help it. Her lip trembled. A smirk escaped her. And then she burst out laughing. She brought a hand to her face, shaking her head as the laughter spilled out. Oh my God, Wednesday. You always have to ruin the moment with a horrible comment. Wednesday tilted her head slightly. It's not horrible. It's realistic. There's a high probability that you'll fall into a depression after all this. Enid didn't get mad. She just shook her head, still trying to catch her breath. Her heart, racing from the shock, was trying to stabilize after the magnitude of what she'd just heard. Never in her life had she imagined this moment would come. Not only would she not lose her best friend, but against all logic, she might get to see Luke again. Love Luke again. Legally and openly. This is huge, Enid finally said, a mix of excitement, vertigo, and restrained emotion in her voice. This is going to change our lives. Wednesday raised an eyebrow. You've already accepted. She'd expected a yes eventually, but not this fast. What else is there to think about? Enid shrugged. I mean, yeah, before, when I was dating Luke, I was jealous. A little intense, but I have no problem sharing him with you. You know how the mate bond works. She paused, then more softly added, besides, I don't want to lose you either. Not as a friend, not as a partner, not as whatever weird thing we've built since the war came back. Wednesday looked at her for a second longer, then spoke in her usual flat, direct tone. Just to be clear, Luke is the romantic center of this equation. I have no interest in you that way. If this starts to feel like an emotional threesome in your head, it's over. Immediately. Enid's mouth dropped open, offended. Obviously, I don't either, she shot back. I only want Luke in that way. You're just my best friend. Wednesday nodded once, as if sealing a legal contract. Perfect. Then no misunderstandings. Structured polygamy. Clear romantic center. Zero lesbian confusion. You're sick, Enid muttered, but she couldn't stop herself from smiling. I have to be thorough, Wednesday replied casually. Enid let out a small, nervous laugh. Then her expression shifted. So, when are you going to tell him? He has no idea yet, right? What if he says no? She asked, trying and failing to hide her anxiety. He has no idea. He doesn't see it coming at all, Wednesday replied with her usual calm. And I'll tell him tomorrow, when I get home. Enid tensed. Do you think he'll accept? Wednesday crossed her arms and leaned back against the desk. For once, she didn't answer right away. I don't know for sure, she admitted without drama. But he said something months ago, after the fight with Elliot in Sunnyvale. He told me that, even though his love for you faded, even though he only has eyes for me now, he still feels something strange for you. Enid watched her, listening closely. That you were his first love, and that if you were ever in danger, he'd save you, without hesitation. That made Enid lower her gaze, slightly moved, cheeks tinted with color. So that's something in our favor, Wednesday concluded. And the downside? Emotional laziness, Wednesday said with almost comical coldness. Having two girls obsessed with him might sound exciting, but it also means more effort than he's willing to invest, more attention, more mental strain, more commitment. Enid couldn't help but smile a little. That did sound like Luke. Enid sighed. Well, at least if he says no, it was fun to imagine. She leaned back dramatically in her chair and added in a dark, but clearly teasing tone. And if he rejects me, if all this was just to give me false hope, I'll kill myself. And I'll haunt you forever, Wednesday. I'll knock your books off the shelves, ruin your experiments, and whisper annoying things behind your back when you try to write your novel or something. Wednesday narrowed her eyes, amused by the dark joke, though her expression didn't change. Well, she said with surgical calm, that way I get to keep you by my side forever as my best friend. You'd never leave, and I wouldn't have to share Luke. Enid shot upright, bursting into disbelieving laughter. What? That's your logic. You emotionally destroy me to keep Luke and enslave me as your ghost friend. The proposal had been made. The first half of this new triangle had accepted. Only one piece remained. Just then, something hit the window. Wednesday and Enid stopped talking and turned their heads at the same time. A black raven tapped the glass with its beak. They both knew what it meant. A new mission. A raven, its feathers black as the abyss, pecked frantically and insistently at the glass. This was no ordinary raven. Wednesday crossed the room, opened the window, and let the messenger in. The bird landed on her desk, a letter tied to its leg, sealed with the council's emblem. Enid stepped up behind her as Wednesday broke the seal with a single finger. The raven watched them in silence, as if it knew the message it carried was no ordinary one. Wednesday's eyes moved line by line, her usual expression hardening even further. "Is it a mission?" Enid asked, though she already knew the answer. Wednesday nodded. "A mid-level psychic family. The Marlowe. Not among the most powerful, but with enough lineage to be a nuisance to the Spellmans," Wednesday replied. "Apparently, a group of hooded figures showed up about 30 minutes ago, wearing masks and demanding allegiance." "They refused. Are they still there?" Enid asked, her shoulders tensing. "According to the last message the council received from them, they're likely still negotiating on the property. They need reinforcements before the intruders lose patience and detect even the slightest hint of doubt or resistance," Wednesday said. Enid frowned. "Negotiating. I'd call it a threat." Wednesday didn't answer immediately. She folded the parchment carefully and tucked it into her coat. "What's wrong?" Enid asked, catching the flicker of unease that crossed her friend's face. "It's strange that the Marlowes were able to send a distress signal without the Spellmans or their lackeys noticing. This tactic isn't new. They always follow the same pattern: surround the house, cut communications, and demand loyalty. If they don't get an immediate yes, they act fast, killing everyone." That's true. It's odd. Every time they use this tactic, by the time we arrive at the family's home, it's too late," Enid murmured. Wednesday nodded. "Exactly. When we get there, the family is already diminished, dead, kidnapped, or with someone being used as leverage. But even if this is a trap, then we still have something just as valuable." "A direct fight," Enid said, understanding. "Against the Spellmans or their dogs." "Yes," Wednesday replied, a cold gleam in her eyes. "And if we're lucky, we could capture one. That's more intel than we've had in weeks." Enid crossed her arms. And what if they really did manage to send for help? If they actually did outsmart the surveillance and are waiting for someone to save them? Then we can't let them die, just because it smells like a trap. They stared at each other in silence. Within 5 minutes, they were ready to leave. However, they wouldn't be going on this mission alone. Given how delicate the situation was, and the very real possibility of an ambush, others had been assigned to join them. 3 Nevermore professors, all with lethal abilities and real-world field experience. Wednesday and Enid joined the professors. They were already familiar, not just from classes, but because the two of them had gone on missions with them before. One of the professors was Alecto Casares, tall, with an imposing presence and Hellenic beauty. Her hair was made up of delicate dark serpents that hissed softly when she moved, always alert. Alecto belonged to one of the 4 great Gorgon families. The second professor was Charles Faulkner, a psychic and direct descendant of Nevermore's very founder. His surname was one of the Great Six, on the same level as the Adams and the Spellmans. Charles wasn't the head of his family, but his reputation preceded him. Slim, elegant, with perfectly combed-back silver hair, he always wore dark gloves, and his lilac eyes held an intensity that seemed to read thoughts without asking. His tone was always polite, and he was known for being incredibly patient, one of the best professors at Nevermore. Finally, Professor Renee Howlett arrived, a werewolf of short stature but powerful build, with defined muscles and tribal tattoos running down both arms. Renee didn't come from any prestigious family, but she had earned her place at Nevermore through sheer merit. Her reputation as a fighter was flawless. The Marlowe estate lay roughly 300 kilometers to the north, in an area between the Vermont mountains and a forested valley where several mid-level psychic families had long established their homes. Traveling by vehicle would have been a waste of time. Wednesday activated her black aura, and her body became more agile, denser, and more precise. She couldn't fly, but her endurance, speed, and leaping ability far surpassed that of any human. She also used her shadow travel to move much faster. Enid, in her hybrid wolf form, was easily her equal. Alecto and Renee were even faster. Alecto glided through the trees like an icy shadow, while Renee ran on all fours when it suited her, growling through clenched teeth with each stride. Charles, on the other hand, didn't have a body built for speed. As a telepath with a blue aura, His strength lay in his mind, but he was far from slow. At 40, he had trained his gifted body to its limits and hadn't neglected his physical conditioning. In about 40 minutes, they covered the first 200 kilometers. The final stretch of the journey took them through a rocky gorge flanked by trees. "What do you know about the Marlows?" Wednesday asked suddenly, without slowing her pace. Charles was the first to answer, his voice resonating clearly though he didn't raise it. "A mid-level psychic family. They have an interesting history, though far from the legacy of the more ancient bloodlines. Their lineage has weakened over the years. They maintain a fairly traditional family structure, focused on discretion and neutrality." "Neutral ideology?" Wednesday asked without turning her head. "Yes, they've never wanted to align themselves with pro-normie ideals, but they also don't subscribe to supremacist views that fully hate normies either," Alecto replied, her serpents gently stirring the air. "Do they have children?" Enid asked. "Yes, two," Riene answered. "They studied at Nevermore years ago. Graduated, spent some time abroad. Last I heard, they came back but didn't do much of note." Alecto turned her face toward Wednesday. "Of course, they're not much if you compare them to your boyfriend, Luke. There's no real comparison," she said with a half-smile. Wednesday looked at her for just a second, but it was enough. Her face didn't change, but in her eyes, a dry spark of restrained pride flickered to life. She knew why Alecto said it. Everyone knew about the incidents Luke had been involved in since his first year at Nevermore. The attack at the Poe Cup, the Blood Moon event the following year, killing Crackstone and Dolar's Spellman, and then the Sunnyvale incident. And considering he had 3 auras, something not seen in decades, maybe longer, he was certainly hard to ignore. 3 auras, Alecto continued. "Though, if we're being honest, there are rumors he has a 4th. And if that's true, we're no longer talking about comparisons. We're talking about a biological exception." "That's not official," Charles murmured softly, though it didn't sound like a denial, more like a diplomatic warning. Rumors had already begun circulating that Luke possessed a 4th aura, especially after he survived Sunnyvale, where he fought Elliot. And as always, it later came to light that he had eliminated Mortimer, a demonic elder and a mid-level demon. Many thought it was madness, and claimed he had a 4th aura just to fan the flames. After all, if he had 3, why not 4? "I know," Alecto said, shrugging. Enid, who had been listening in silence, felt her heart quicken. Pride, a warm emotion that had become forbidden to her. For a long time, she'd avoided thinking of Luke with that kind of intensity. Every time she remembered him, it hurt. Too much. But now something had changed. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel that pride without guilt, without needing to suppress it, because there was hope. Because, even if the idea was new, strange, and still unanswered by Luke, Wednesday had reached out a hand, had opened a door. A real possibility. She glanced at Wednesday from the corner of her eye. She was still moving swiftly, her expression monotone, as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just shattered the entire board with her proposal. But Enid knew her. She knew how hard it was for her to give up even an inch of emotional control, and what it meant that she had offered that to her. She wasn't just her best friend. She was something more, a partner, not in the romantic sense, but in the essential one. The only person she could share something as twisted, complex, and visceral as their love for Luke. And for the first time in a long while, Enid didn't feel the need to run from what she felt. There was nothing to hide, no shame. Only one truth: she still loved him, and she no longer had to pretend otherwise. They continued moving until they finally arrived. The group stopped atop a hill. Half a kilometer below stood the Marlowe estate, dark, old, Victorian in architecture. The lights were on, no screaming, no fire, and that only made it more unsettling. Charles narrowed his eyes, his lilac gaze glowing faintly. His mind expanded like an invisible web, stretching toward the estate with surgical precision. "I can clearly sense 11 presences," he said at last. 3 are in the backyard, the others inside the house. "Can you recognize the Marlowe?" Wednesday asked. No, I'm not a clairvoyant, unfortunately, but I can feel 4 minds in a weakened state. Given that it's a family of 4, it's likely them. Their psychic signatures are scrambled, suggesting severe physical pain or extreme stress, but they're alive and conscious. So they did manage to send a signal, murmured Alecto, her serpents hissing in unease. What's strange, Charles added with a slight frown, is that they're still alive. That's not the Spellman's style. Once they detect hesitation, they act. Swiftly, they execute. And it's been over 40 minutes of talking. Could it be a trap? Renee asked, arms crossed tensely. It could, but if it is, the Marlowes are truly suffering. This isn't an illusion. You can't fake that level of mental trauma, Charles replied. Then, in a colder tone, he added, either way, we can't walk away. If it's a trap, we'll need one of the Spellmans alive to interrogate. And if it's not, we have to stop the family from being murdered. If there are 4 Marlowe, that means there are 7 enemies, said Wednesday. Charles's brow tightened. Yes, 3 in the garden, 4 inside. I can sense them, dark, steady. Their thoughts are shielded, and if I go any deeper, they'll notice me. But one of them is extremely powerful, might be a Spellman. A heavy silence fell over the group. Wednesday took command naturally. We enter from the east, fast, quiet. We take out the ones in the garden first before they can raise the alarm. Then we move inside. If any of them is a Spellman, top priority, capture them. If we can't. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Good, Renee growled, rolling her shoulders. Let's move before they decide to execute the entire Marlowe family. The group descended the hill, vanishing into the night. Inside the Marlowe estate, the tension was thick. Mr. Marlowe was breathing heavily. A deep gash on the left side of his abdomen soaked his shirt with blood, barely allowing him to stay upright. Beside him, his wife trembled, her face pale, a shaky hand clutching her son's arm. The son, in his early 20s, had a face swollen from beatings, split lips, and eyes burning with restrained fury. He held his younger sister close with one arm. The girl, more injured than the others, had a deep cut on her forehead and a severe burn on her left shoulder that made her clench her teeth to avoid screaming. In front of them, seated with offensive calm on the main room's armchairs, were the Spellman twins, Anna and Jane. Both had ashen blonde hair, straight like wet wires, mercury gray eyes, and black dresses of an old-fashioned, almost ceremonial style. Their faces were identical, as were their smiles, thin, venomous, devoid of any empathy. "Come now, Mr. Marlowe," said Anna, crossing her legs with feigned elegance. "That answer was wrong again. Do you want to die with your whole family?" "My answer won't change," Mr. Marlowe spat on the floor with contempt. "I won't help filth that makes pacts with demons. You're not leaders, you're trash with lineage." A cold silence fell over the room. Jane narrowed her eyes. Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of icy disdain. She stared at him as one would a bug that dared speak. Without breaking her gaze, she slightly turned her head toward the servant standing near the fireplace. The man needed no words. He was tall, robed in a dark garment with no markings, his face completely deformed. No eyes, no nose, just skin cracked like dry bark, 2 breathing holes, and a mouth full of crooked teeth. Something between human and abomination. He advanced silently, like a mental command made flesh. Without hesitation, he struck Mr. Marlowe with the back of his open hand. The crack was immediate. 3 teeth flew through the air, and the man's head snapped to the side from the blow, releasing a muffled grunt of pain. "Father!" the son screamed, filled with visceral rage, trying to lunge forward. But he couldn't. Though there were no visible ropes or restraints, his body didn't respond. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move an inch. The veins in his neck bulged from the futile effort. "Don't try it, boy," came a deep voice. It was Margaret Spellman, standing by the fireplace. She dressed soberly, like a noble matriarch who had refused to grow old in spirit. Her white hair was tied into a perfect bun, her face sharp. Her hands gloved. She was the mother of Elliot and Gabriel, the surviving matriarch of one of the main Spellman branches. Alongside Anna and Jane, her granddaughters, she was one of the last survivors of Elliot and Gabriel's line. Luke had taken care of most of the others. She was the one holding the boy and his family motionless. Her aura hung like an invisible net over them all. "You're within my domain. You can scream all you want, struggle all you like, but you won't move a single inch. You'll only hurt yourself," she added in a monotone. Anna then stood slowly from her seat and began walking toward Mr. Marlowe. Her right hand began to distort, as if evaporating, the fingers turning into a greenish, dense mist that bubbled softly like poison. "Ruining the face of this proud, wise old man might be fun," she said with a dangerous smile. She was half a step away from touching his face when Margaret spoke, without raising her voice. "Anna, stop." The twin froze. Then she turned on her heel with a grimace, hiding her hand as the venom dissipated. Margaret turned to Mr. Marlowe. Blood dripped from his mouth, but he looked at her with stubborn dignity. "We're not idiots," said the old woman. "We know you sent a signal. That's exactly why we didn't kill you right away. You're the bait." "I see," Mr. Marlowe replied with a bitter grimace. "That's why you're so chatty, strutting around and sitting like this where you're home. Otherwise, you'd have executed us already for refusing." "And what if no one comes?" he added, wearing a defiant smile despite the pain. "Even you must admit this reeks of a trap from the very entrance. Maybe no one will fall for it." Margaret didn't flinch. She walked slowly until she stood in front of the fireplace, her back to the group, gazing into the flames as if they spoke to her. "They will come," she said at last, her tone icy. "Because the balance is in a fragile state. Even a family like yours, not among the oldest, matters right now." She turned slowly. Her grayish gaze fell upon Mr. Marlowe like a sentence. "I admit it, Donovan. I respect you. Not for your ideals, those are outdated, but for your strength. If you weren't wounded by my hand, you could defeat several of the outcasts who now serve us. You could even beat one of my granddaughters in a fair duel. I won't deny it." The twins, off to the side, exchanged an uncomfortable glance for the first time. Though they were powerful and talented for their age, they knew the old woman didn't speak lightly. Margaret leaned slightly toward him, a venomous curiosity in her voice. "Who will they send? The circulating outcast houses are too weak to attempt a rescue mission. No, if anyone comes, it will be from Nevermore. They're close enough." She straightened slowly, letting her gaze wander over the wounded members of the Marlowe family. Her tone became almost didactic. "Most likely professors, and they'll send the funeral star, Wednesday Addams, with her little werewolf pet." The twins reacted instantly. Anna smirked to the side. "Oh, the adorable goth girl, remember her, sister?" "Yes," Jane replied with a chilling sweetness. "Her robot face was so cute, and how she cried when we killed her pet scorpion. What was his name? Neuron." "No, Nero," Anna corrected with a nostalgic air, as if recalling a happy childhood memory rather than a cruel act. Mr. Marlowe looked at them, lips stained with blood, his voice dry but with a mocking grin. "Of course, you want revenge. That's normal after Poe and the Addams girl slaughtered so many of yours." There was a biting truth in his words. Luke carried the weight of many Spellman deaths. During the blood moon at Nevermore, he killed Ingrid and Sebastian, Margaret's grandchildren, in a battle that marked the beginning of his legend. That same night, he also eliminated Atlas, one of the family's oldest and most respected servants, known for his silent brutality and unwavering loyalty. A short time later, Wednesday and Luke came back and killed Crackstone. Then, with Fester's help, they killed Dolar's Spellman. Many believed Fester played a more important role in eliminating the Spellman matriarch, but everyone knew Wednesday and Luke had been weakened, since they fought Crackstone together. Later, in Sunnyvale, the reputation of Luke and Wednesday as Spellman bloodline hunters was sealed. They assisted in the deaths of Elliot and Gabriel, or so the official version says, since the credit was given to Gomez and Fester. Not because they wanted to steal recognition, but to make sure Luke and Wednesday would be underestimated by their enemies. However, the Spellman family didn't believe this false information. They knew Gomez and Fester had been intercepted by Elder Spellmans, which left only one possibility. Luke killed Elliot, and Wednesday, with Enid and the others, killed Gabriel. Margaret gave Donovan a dangerous look. But he, far from backing down, offered a crooked smile. The atmosphere grew heavier. Even the shadows seemed to crush the air. "And what if the Poe boy shows up?" Donovan asked, like someone wondering if a storm is coming. "What will you do then? Pray. His girlfriend can call for him, remember, he's a telepath, and also a telekinetic. He could come flying like a rocket." The twins, heirs to the purest hatred, said nothing, but the tension in their faces was impossible to hide. Because they knew Luke wasn't dead. He had returned. After Elliot's death, it became known that Luke had been unconscious and was taken to the Adams mansion. He didn't participate in the trial that marked the fall of the Spellmans, which made it obvious he had fallen into a coma after the fight. But he hadn't died. Months ago, there had been news of him. He had reappeared briefly in Centralia, a dead city burning beneath the ground. The Spellmans had sent Mortimer, along with a mid-level demon capable of tracking his scent, to hunt him down. A force even Elliot and Gabriel would have been cautious to face. Considering that Luke had nearly died against Elliot and ended up in a coma, they believed this formation was more than enough. Mortimer's telekinesis was far superior to Luke's, or so they thought. But nothing came back from Centralia. No report, no sign, just an eloquent absence. Which meant one thing: both of them were likely killed by Luke. In Centralia, there was a massive gash in the earth, as if an earthquake had split the land, but the cut was clean, flawless. To the Spellmans, that could only mean one thing: the Poe weapon. Which makes sense, otherwise. How could Luke have killed Mortimer and Zarvok? "It's possible the boy will come, and if he does, this time it won't be so easy to get out of here alive," said Margaret, looking Donovan in the eyes. He held her gaze, but felt a pang in his gut. Something wasn't right. Margaret wasn't someone who spoke without weight. If she said it like that, with such certainty in her voice, it was because she had something prepared. A contingency plan, an invisible web he couldn't yet see. "Did more of those bastards come?" Donovan thought, tense. "But I don't sense any of them." At that moment, Margaret smiled, a cold, restrained smirk barely curving her lips. "They're already inside," she whispered with satisfaction. She moved one of her hands with elegance, and the dark ring she wore shimmered with a red rune. An invisible shiver ran through the house. Something had been activated. Donovan barely had time to glance toward the fireplace when the air's temperature shifted. The previously heavy atmosphere turned suffocating. Margaret turned her head to the twins and the servant. "Go ahead. You can kill now. We don't need them anymore." Mr. Marlowe looked up in disbelief. His body could barely hold itself upright, but his survival instinct flared like a dying flame resisting extinction. "What are you doing?" "Why do you think we kept you alive?" Margaret replied, her tone bored, as if explaining something painfully obvious. "If we had killed you and waited, it wouldn't have worked. Not with Charles. He would have realized you were all dead and we were just waiting. He would have known it was a trap, and they wouldn't have crossed." She paused right at the back door, ready to begin the main slaughter, then turned slightly toward Donovan. "But if there's a chance to save someone, if they believe you're still breathing, they'll come. And now that they're within range, they can't escape." Outside, in the garden, a faint hum, imperceptible to a normie, began to emanate from the runes buried beneath the soil. The trap was closed. "You may kill him now." The abominable servant took a step toward Donovan. But the old Marlowe patriarch, drenched in blood, his face bruised and his eyes blazing with fury, did something unexpected. His body began to burn from the inside. His veins glowed with a supernatural red. His skin cracked like stone under pressure. He was burning from within. "Father, no," his children cried out, still immobilized. With his final will, Donovan unleashed a psychic explosion. A burst of life energy that not only freed his family, but also collapsed half a wall of the room and hurled the Spellmans backwards. Margaret barely managed to raise a shield to protect herself from the blast, which had been aimed directly at them. The servant was thrown into a pillar, the wood groaning with a sharp crack. Donovan dropped to his knees. A second later, his body collapsed to the ground, completely charred and lifeless. The boy and the girl had tears in their eyes and were about to run toward their father, but their mother quickly stopped them and shouted, "We need to go, now." They were injured, and even if they hadn't been, there was no way they could defeat Margaret Spellman, her two granddaughters, and the servant. They had to escape and meet up with the people the council had sent to rescue them. Fortunately, they understood how dire the situation was and followed their mother toward the door leading to the gardens. Outside in the gardens, Wednesday, Charles, Renee, Enid, and Alecto were engaged in battle. Their ambush had failed. Despite attempting a stealth attack, the hooded figures had known of their arrival. They had clearly been prepared. Still, since it was 5 against 3, they had managed to severely wound one of them and moderately injure another, so the first exchange hadn't been all bad. A barrier had been activated, trapping them inside with a faint electric hum. "We can't get out," Charles confirmed, his brow slightly furrowed. "It's not just a barrier that pushes you back. Chances are if you try to cross it, it'll disintegrate you. The only way would be to attack a specific point and open a crack," added Alecto, already analyzing the structure with her serpent-like eyes. The 3 hooded figures before them remained in battle stance, but did not attack. They knew they were outnumbered, and their job wasn't to win, but to hold them off. Hold them off until the real threat arrived. Just then, the explosion from Donovan Marlowe's sacrifice shook the air, a wave of smoke and magic blasting out from inside the mansion. And from among the rubble, 3 figures came running, Mrs. Marlowe and her 2 children, badly injured but alive. "This way," shouted Charles, charging toward the hooded figures blocking the Marlowe's path. Wednesday and Enid rushed in behind him, followed by Renee and Alecto. They had to clear the way. The battle erupted instantly. Blows, roars, mental waves, and blasts of darkness filled the air. The hooded attackers could barely defend themselves. Thanks to the chaos, the Marlowes reached the defensive line. The daughter dropped to her knees, coughing up blood. The son, eyes glassy and face hardened by rage, muttered, "My father, he sacrificed himself." "Then get ready to fight," said Wednesday firmly, devoid of compassion. "Don't let it be in vain." A new sound broke the moment, footsteps through the smoke. The Spellman twins emerged with irritated expressions, as if someone had ruined their date. Behind them came the deformed servant, staggering, his skin cracked like old wood, twisted teeth bared in an animalistic snarl. And finally, Margaret, upright, unscathed, her face emotionless, as if she knew that no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape. "Stupid old fool," Jane sneered with annoyance. "He blew himself up like a dog just to waste our time." "He stole the pleasure of killing him ourselves," added Anna with a sickly sweet voice that was more threatening than any growl. "Still, he achieved his goal, saved his family for a few more minutes. How romantic, isn't it?" She smiled, as if recounting a love story that moved her. Margaret took a few steps forward, carefully eyeing the group that had come to rescue them. Her gaze lingered a bit longer on each of the teachers, and finally stopped on Wednesday. Well, the Addams heiress herself, and her pet following her around. Enid frowned, but didn't rise to the provocation. She simply clenched her fists and kept her jaw tight. Wednesday ignored the remark, not because it didn't offend her, but because it wasn't worth the effort. She was analyzing. Numerical advantage. Their group had 8. Herself, Enid, Charles, Alecto, Renee, the 2 Marlowe children, and Mrs. Marlowe. On the other side, Margaret, the twins, the abominable servant, and 3 hooded figures, 7 in total, but the difference was merely symbolic. The Marlowes were wounded, physically and emotionally, though maybe that brutal loss could work in their favor. Vengeance was a powerful catalyst. The 3 hooded figures weren't unscathed either. One had an arm partially hanging, another was bleeding from the side. Only the third remained steady. Margaret was without a doubt the real threat. Complete serenity, no rush, no exhaustion. 70 years was no weakness, it was power accumulated, probably beyond even Charles or Alecto. Then, as if they were girls reunited at a picnic, Anna and Jane raised their hands in a mocking wave. "Wens, remember us. We're the ones who killed your scorpion pet, one of the many I guess," said Anna. "Such a lovely moment," added Jane. "You should cry more often, it softens your cheekbones." "These bitches," Enid thought, her brow furrowing. Wednesday slowly raised an eyebrow. Her face remained a mask of calm, but a dense shadow began to form in her left hand. A dark scythe with blurred edges materialized gradually, pulsing with an ethereal rhythm. "It's been months since I killed one of you. Gabriel was the last, wasn't he?" Wednesday said, as if recalling a rainy afternoon. "Your father, right?" Anna narrowed her eyes. Jane no longer smiled. Wednesday tilted her head slightly, and for a moment she smiled. It wasn't wide or mocking, just a crooked, tense, ice-cold line. "How's that going?" Wednesday asked with that barely there smirk. "The loss, being orphans, must be tough, painful, though maybe Margaret comforts you and cooks for you like the good grandmother she must be." The smile didn't grow, but it didn't fade either. It remained there, raw, dry, terrifying. A smile no teenager should ever wear. The twins stayed silent, not for lack of words, but because, for a second, they truly didn't know what to say. It was Margaret who stepped forward, her voice as flat as her stare. "You talk too much, girl." Wednesday ignored her and continued. "I've always wondered if I could catch up to Luke in the Spellman body count. Maybe today's the day. He's ahead for now, but who knows? Maybe tonight I tie him and surpass him." The silence that followed was thick. Wednesday continued without flinching. "Do you remember your cousin Ingrid?" she said, and something in her voice cracked toward the unsettling. "Oh, that was a fun session. I tore out her eyes, but without killing her, of course. I left her there, writhing in her own fluids. She begged, she babbled." An even darker silence followed. And then Luke arrived and broke her. Literally, a ball of unrecognizable flesh. I've never seen anything so aesthetically disgusting and delightful. The smile on her face was no longer restrained. It was wide, frozen, joyless. A smile from someone who could easily be considered a psychopath. The professors looked at each other with strange expressions. Everything Wednesday said was true. They had seen Ingrid's condition during the blood moon years ago, and how Luke shattered her body with his telekinesis. But the disturbing thing was not the facts themselves. It was how she said it, with that surgical calm, that cheerful coldness, that artistic satisfaction. Even the three hooded ones, hardened by years of violence and dark rites, showed the slightest shift in posture. One of them swallowed slowly. Another lowered his hand toward his belt, as if needing to hold on to something tangible. Enid, for her part, remained impassive, cold, and even though she knew Wednesday was letting out her darkest side, she didn't move a muscle. It was then that a female voice was heard. Serene, firm, with an ancient, venomous elegance. "Do you mock our blood even after its death, Adam's girl?" The phrase floated for a second or two, and from a dark corner of the garden, where no one, not even Charles, had sensed any presence, two figures emerged. A man and a woman, tall, impeccable, dressed in black without symbols or embellishments. Their skin was pale as wax, their hair ash blonde, lighter even than the twins. They appeared to be in their 30s, but something in their presence, in their expressions, spoke of an age far older. Margaret, for the first time, lowered her gaze. Lord Aldrich, Lady Vespera. The twins also gave a subtle gesture. It wasn't courtesy, it was reverence. Wednesday narrowed her eyes. The entire garden seemed to contract. "So this is the Adams heiress," said Vespera, her voice cold and curious. "The dramatic flair, the cruel humor, it's clear she wasn't raised by the Frump side of the family." The Frumps were considered more gothic, more like nobility, not quite as eerie. The Adams had a different reputation, lunatics who adored death and the macabre. "Does it offend you, Vespera?" said the man, Aldrich, stretching his neck lazily. Bah, it's not her fault. If our descendants weren't so disappointing, they wouldn't have died in such pathetic ways. His eyes, pale gray, nearly without pupils, gleamed like steel under the moon. Now that they were closer, their appearances became clearer. Vespera Spellman wore a long jet-black dress, unadorned, just a thin line of blood-red lace at the wrists. Her hair, almost white, fell straight to her waist, and her skin had a translucent, spectral tone. She moved with a fluid elegance. Her beauty was disturbing, the kind that seemed sculpted by someone who had never felt love, only obsession. Aldrich, on the other hand, had a lazier bearing. His long velvet coat hung open, revealing a chiseled torso, almost too perfect, like something carved from marble, pale as his companion. Wednesday and the others noticed one important detail. Margaret had called them Lord Aldrich and Lady Vespera with absolute respect. But they hadn't responded to the greeting, not even a glance, not a nod. That alone was enough to understand the truth. They weren't ordinary members of the family. They were demonic ancestors of the Spellman bloodline. But unlike others, they didn't have wrinkled, aged bodies. Clearly, they were now at a disadvantage, not just in numbers, but in power. It was highly unlikely that any of the professors could face one of those two demonic elders in one-on-one combat. There was no escape. The barrier was still active, like a cage. Breaking it would require time, focus, and energy they couldn't afford to spare. What do? We can't win this, Renee asked through a telepathic message. The voice reached Wednesday, Enid, and the others. Charles had created a group mental chat. I'm thinking, if those two join the fight, we'll be in serious trouble, especially if they attack alongside Margaret, said Charles. Resistance, fight while falling back, the Marlowe girl suggested. Fall back where? The barrier traps us like animals. If we try to break it, we'll disrupt the formation, and those left holding the line will be in even worse shape, Alecto replied. We hold the line, and endure. There's nothing else to say, said Wednesday, noticing that their enemies were already about to strike. The wind sliced at perfect angles against Luke's telekinetic shield. He was traveling at a relatively low speed for his current level, barely 200 kilometers per hour. He floated 300 meters above the ground, with Naira, the Wendigo, suspended in a gravitational field beside him. The Wendigo was curled in a fetal position, wrapped in a black cloak that had once belonged to Morticia Adams. Her eyes were tightly shut, as if the outside world was too bright, and every so often she let out a low, annoyed growl when the air stirred more than expected. It wasn't fear. It was distaste. Naira didn't like flying. Her body was made to hunt through underbrush, to climb trees like a pale shadow, stalking prey through broken branches and mud. The sky, though she tolerated it, was still an environment she didn't understand. That's why Luke had reduced the speed, a gesture of consideration, though he wouldn't admit it out loud. His training had finally come to an end. He couldn't keep himself locked away like a meditating monk. The war had reached a high tension point, and Luke had already proven himself elite when he killed Mortimer Spellman a few months back. He could no longer afford to extend his training and remain uninvolved. It was time to take part. Since he hadn't left Adams Manor in a long time, he traveled calmly, watching the landscape below. His destination, nevermore. Wednesday would finish school tomorrow, and Luke wanted to surprise her with a visit. Naira, who had come to see them as her parents, wanted to visit her mother after so long. After all, it had already been 3 months since they had adopted her. Though the word was more symbolic than legal, the creature had taken it with brutal literalness. At first, Luke hadn't corrected Naira because he enjoyed seeing Wednesday's expression whenever the little one called her mother. It was funny, and it gave him something to tease her about. However, by now it was far too late to correct the little Wendigo, and Luke had ended up paying the price. He was now officially considered Dad. "Slow down, Dad," Naira suddenly shouted, eyes still closed, teeth chattering from the vibrations. Luke closed his eyes for a second and let out a brief sigh. His right eyebrow twitched. We're already going at grandma speed. If we slow down anymore, it'll take forever to reach Nevermore, Luke replied. Forever? I don't think so, Dad. You're miscalculating the distance and the speed we're already traveling, Naira shot back, finally opening one eye, which glowed with that eerie red light that would send chills down many an outcast's spine. Is she correcting me? Luke thought, glancing sideways at her. Naira had changed. Since being freed from the normie lab, the little one had been a wild whirlwind, no language, no control, sheer blind brutality. But now she spoke very well. She learned fast. She was a bizarre mix between a fierce cub and a brilliant student. Morticia had taught her good manners. Fester trained her to track, hunt, and stalk, an experience Naira loved with every fiber of her being. Gomez, when he had the time, also tried to train her in fencing, or at least he pretended to. He mostly just had fun, since Naira couldn't care less about learning sword techniques. And Luke used her for training. Her raw strength was ideal for testing shields, reflexes, and new techniques. He never truly hurt her, but he did push her to the limit more than once, and Naira adored him for it. A strange bond, hard to explain, but real. Luke, a 16-year-old teenager, now had an adoptive daughter who was technically older than him, but mentally, she was around 12 or 13. And not even a telekinetic bomb could get rid of her. Stop being such a coward, Luke finally said. It's not fear, Naira snapped, clearly offended. I like the ground. I like feeling the earth under my feet, smelling trails, following tracks, hearing the leaves, the forest. And slashing throats, Luke added. The Wendigo girl gave a sideways grin, showing her fangs. She had that mischievous, childlike, and utterly predatory expression. A very Addams-like combination, and Luke couldn't help but feel she had adapted surprisingly well to the family. Well, if I get to see Mom soon, I'll endure it, said Naira, shifting in the gravitational field with reluctant resignation. Luke couldn't help but smile slightly, more amused than anything. He remembered the first time Naira called her that, Mother. She had done it right in front of Wednesday, totally naturally. And although Wednesday only raised an eyebrow with her usual gothic indifference, Luke caught the micro-expression. That tiny blink, that barely tensed muscle near the corner of her mouth. It was glorious. Of course, afterward, he had to endure several days of passive-aggressive comments. Still, even Wednesday had accepted Naira. She'd never admit it, of course, but every time Naira jumped into their calls and started telling her about what she had hunted, the new bones she was cleaning, or how she beat Fester in a hunt, either by cheating or because Fester let her win, Wednesday never cut her off, never ignored her. She replied, never with a smile, obviously, but she replied. That's the spirit, kid, Luke said mockingly. The family reunion's coming up. Everyone's going to see Wednesday has a daughter. I can't wait to see their faces. He stayed silent for a moment, imagining the scene. The Nevermore courtyard, the faces of Xavier, Ajax, Bianca, the teachers. And Wednesday trying not to kill anyone when Naira jumped up and shouted, Mom, in front of everyone. Beautiful. Dad, Naira said in a serious voice, without even opening her eyes. I can smell that you're planning to mess with Mom. Luke turned his head slightly. Oh, yeah. Yes, your blood temperature just rose by 0.5 degree. It always happens when you get too excited imagining something, Naira stated flatly. Luke sighed. Damn instinctual precision. And it's going to cost you, she added with a sepulchral tone. Mom's going to be mad, really mad. Luke remained quiet. He knew she wasn't exaggerating. Wednesday had a high tolerance for threats, but a very low one for mockery. Of course, hardly anyone ever dared to joke with her, only Luke did. And just at that moment, before Luke could respond, he received a telepathic message. A clean, direct voice without a trace of emotion, one he recognized instantly. Wednesday. Marlowe Estate, Vermont, Eastern Forest Sector, reinforced barrier. We can't get out and we're outnumbered. 9 hostiles. The most dangerous are 2 elder Spellmans and Margaret Spellman. We're barely holding on with 3 teachers, Enid, and 2 members of the Marlowe family. I need help. Luke felt his heartbeat spike. There was no panic in Wednesday's tone, no drama, just facts, data. What alarmed him most was Wednesday asking for help. If she was doing that, it meant the situation was serious. 2 elders, Luke thought, frowning. I'll be there in 10 minutes, he replied. Dad, Naira asked, noticing his furrowed brow. Get ready to speed up and fight, Luke replied without looking at her. Naira straightened slightly. Her eyes lit up with excitement. Fight, good. Speed, not so much. Luke raised one hand and reinforced the field around her, hardening it. Then, he extended his other hand forward, redirecting all the telekinetic force he had been using to float gently into a single burst. Boom! The acceleration was brutal. The air cracked with a sharp sonic boom. The landscape blurred. Luke rose past 1,000 meters in altitude to avoid obstacles and reduce drag. The trees below turned into green smears, the mountains like miniature models. Naira let out a muffled growl and yelled, "This is not Grandma's speed." Luke didn't answer. His mind was already focused on getting there as fast as possible to help Wednesday. Not excited by the fight, he was anxious to make sure nothing happened to Wednesday. Marlowe Manor. The garden of the estate was a battlefield. Torn up earth, scorched trees, deep cracks running through the lawn like scars. And amidst that chaos, the sounds of energy blasts, stifled screams, and attacks filled the air. Mrs. Marlowe lay beneath the twisted roots of an old oak tree. Her condition was unknown. Her unmoving body had been forgotten amid the chaos. Her fall had made the defense even more difficult, and only a few minutes had passed since the battle had begun. Her children's, the Marlowe boy and girl, did not retreat. They fought with the raw rage of those who have nothing left to lose. Their wounds were numerous, fractured bones, burned flesh, gashes revealing muscle. And yet they didn't fall. As if hatred and despair were the only things keeping them upright, heirs driven mad by the loss of their father and now their mother as well. At the center of the battlefield, the 3 Nevermore professors had formed a defensive triangle. Charles, bleeding from his nose and one eye, was using his energy to maintain a mental shield around the group. The pressure he was under was colossal. His forehead was soaked in sweat, his thoughts racing, his mind constantly under assault from psychic interference coming from Aldrich, the elderly spellman with a young face and eyes of liquid steel. Aldrich's presence was overwhelming. His telepathic aura was a black ocean crashing in waves. If it weren't for Charles, the others, with weaker mental defenses, might have already fallen into illusions or crippling psychic pain. Worst of all, Aldrich wasn't just a telepath. His body had been enhanced through demonic pacts. While Charles possessed the enhanced physique of a psychic outcast, it was still average by physical standards, easily surpassed by werewolves, vampires, and others who specialized in raw strength. But Aldrich didn't have that disadvantage. In fact, his strength and speed exceeded even Enid's in her fully transformed werewolf state. One of his blows had sent her flying back several meters, nearly breaking her transformed arm. Vespera was a darkness wielder, like Wednesday. Dark, dense orbs spun around her hands and behind her, dancing like silent comets that detonated on contact with lethal pressure. Wednesday barely managed to dodge the attacks. She also wielded darkness, but the power difference was clear. Vespera commanded her element as if she had been born in the shadows. There was a deadly beauty in her movements, an emotionless elegance. And like her demonic companion, Vespera also had a body enhanced beyond what was normally possible for a psychic without a green aura. She surpassed Professor Riene, a fully transformed werewolf whose strength reached 30 tons. Though the difference between them wasn't as brutal as the one between Enid and Aldrich. Margaret was no less dangerous. Unlike the other 2, her power for now was natural. Her hands burned with bright orange flames, conjuring pure fire from her elemental orange aura. And that wasn't all. She was a dual aura user. Her second aura was telekinesis, and far from weak. She wasn't on Mortimer Spellman's level, who could reach 70 tons, but Wednesday had struggled to deflect some of her attacks, and even she was beginning to falter. The twins, Jane and Anna, could barely keep up. Their power wasn't negligible, but at this level they were simply support units. The three hooded figures, hidden behind masks and betrayal, maintained tactical pressure and offered support. Like Jane and Anna, they couldn't keep up with the three elder Spellmans, and two of them were already injured. And finally, the Spellman servant. 2 meters tall, pure muscle, a deformed face, grayish skin, and eyes that barely showed emotion. He didn't speak. He only struck. So far, the only thing he had demonstrated was his raw strength, slightly below Enid's. Charles couldn't hold out much longer. His mind was vibrating, his vision blurring, sweat soaking his collar. Aldrich was overpowering him, not just in psychic skill, but in presence, speed, and physical power. Charles had already sent a telepathic message to Nevermore, requesting urgent backup. With luck, reinforcements would arrive in a few minutes. But there was a problem. An advanced barrier surrounded the estate, reinforced, complex. Breaking through it wouldn't be immediate. And by the time they managed it, they might all be dead. Even if they managed to break the barrier quickly and all the professors entered, Charles doubted the outcome would change drastically. Yes, the defensive balance would improve. They might gain seconds, maybe minutes. But it wouldn't be enough to defeat 3 Spellman elders. The 3 damned elders. They were monsters, real monsters. And yet, Charles still had hope, because he realized Wednesday had sent another telepathic message. And that could only mean one thing. Luke Poe, the boy Charles had once trained, the student with 3 auras, the killer of Mortimer Spellman, the heir of the Poe bloodline. If anyone can change the outcome of this battle, it's him, Charles thought, suppressing a mental spasm as another psychic wave crashed against his shield. And then hell intensified. A torn scream split the air. Lya. It was the Marlowe brother, the girl Lya had just fallen. Margaret, with a sharp gesture, had unleashed a concentrated spiral of fire that struck the young woman's chest, shattering her defenses. The explosion hurled her several meters backward. She crashed violently into the rose bushes, her body convulsing, wrapped in smoke and blood. The defensive line broke again. Now they were 1 fewer. Charles turned pale, but there was nothing more he could do. That was when Aldrich appeared to his right, moving with absurd speed. A single strike, aimed directly at his head. Shit, Charles thought. If that hit landed, he'd be half dead at best. But Enid got in the way. Fully transformed into her werewolf form, she used both arms to block the attack, letting out a deep, ferocious roar. The impact was brutal. The blow sent her spinning through the air like a rag doll. She bounced off the ground, slammed into a column, and collapsed to the side, gasping. She barely had time to get back up before she felt another presence. The Spellman servant, fist raised like a hammer, coming straight for her head. At the same time, Alecto, the Gorgon, was intercepted by a blazing chain of fire that Margaret summoned with deadly precision and speed. The professor cursed and was sent flying, her body spinning like a broken mythic figure, crashing into a garden statue and shattering it. Wednesday was still holding on, but now she was in a critical situation with neither Enid, Alecto, nor Lya at her side. Vespera's dark orbs swirled around her, a deadly ballet. Each one demanded precise evasion, perfect defense, but Wednesday wasn't unbreakable. She was tired, fighting against a greater force. Then Margaret looked at her, a faint wrinkled smile on her face. She extended a hand and conjured a massive fireball, burning with immense power. When Wednesday saw the fireball and the heat radiating from it, she couldn't help but compare it to Ingrid. Same elemental power. Totally different scale, like comparing a child to an adult. Without hesitation, Margaret hurled the fireball at Wednesday. Simultaneously, Vespera launched 3 orbs, 1 center, 2 on the flanks. A coordinated assault, perfect execution. Wednesday raised her left arm to shield herself with a barrier of darkness, but her strength was nearly depleted. She could block one, maybe two, but not four simultaneous, high-powered attacks. Professor Riane, fully transformed into a werewolf, saw both Enid and Wednesday in critical condition, but the three hooded figures and the twin sisters were attacking her relentlessly to prevent her from giving support. "Damn trash," she roared, sending one of the masked attackers flying. But it was already too late to help her teammates. The attacks were about to strike Wednesday. And then space distorted. And right in front of Wednesday, a figure appeared, one she recognized instantly. A broad back, a curved sword in hand, vibrating with psychic energy. Luke. He had used shambles to bypass the barrier without breaking it. Wednesday barely had time to blink. Her shoulders relaxed instinctively. Elsewhere in the garden, Enid, still gasping, her body trembling from Aldrich's brutal hit, was struggling to get up. And in front of her, the massive Spellman's servant, his fist raised like a hammer, was about to strike her head with full force, and she wouldn't be able to defend herself. But something faster than thought intervened. An inhuman roar rang out, deep, wild. And from the sky, Naira descended. The Wendigo, small but powerful. Her eyes glowed with a supernatural hue. Her claws were extended, her expression that of a primal predator. With a brutal leap, she landed between Enid and the servant. And without giving him time to react, she drove a punch straight into his abdomen. Crack! The servant flew like a projectile, slamming into a stone wall that collapsed in a rain of rubble. And while that happened, Luke was facing the attacks aimed directly at his girlfriend. With Eclipse in hand, he raised his sword with absolute fluidity and launched an upward slash toward the fireball. The energy concentrated in the blade expanded with a deep hum, as if it were slicing through the very air. A telekinetic blade emerged, crystal clear, sharp as final judgment. Margaret's fireball, burning like a compressed sun, was split in half. It exploded midair in a burst of flames. The telekinetic slash kept going. Vespera's 3 dark orbs arrived a second later, launched in formation. An encircling strike, 1 down the center, 2 on the sides, converging like a trap. But Luke already knew. His foresight had shown him exactly where they would hit. His feet slid subtly across the ground, left knee dropping half a step. His torso rotated with clockwork precision. And his right arm, strong enough to lift 5 tons thanks to the development of his green aura, executed 3 consecutive slashes. The sword danced in his hands like it had a life of its own, a perfect extension of his body. The first orb split straight down the middle. The second cleaved diagonally. The third pierced with a thrust. Wednesday, seeing Luke neutralize the attacks, noticed something different in his style. More refined, precise, lethal. She could see the influence of her father, master of a fencing style that was baroque, classical, and brutal. The orbs vanished. The battlefield cleared for an instant. And Luke lowered his sword slowly, as if everything that had just happened was nothing more than a warm-up. The telekinetic blade that had cut through Margaret's massive fireball continued on its path afterward, as if it had been designed to go further from the very beginning. Margaret, who had barely a fraction of a second to react, tried to pull back. But even an experienced psychic with dual aura couldn't completely dodge an invisible cut launched with the force of 20 tons, condensed into a perfect line. The slash didn't cut her in half, though that had been Luke's intent. Her left arm, from the shoulder down, was launched into the air. It fell among the withered flowers of the garden, still burning. Margaret stepped back with a grimace of pain, but without screaming. Her aged face trembled between fury and wounded pride. After cleanly slicing through the dark orbs, Luke saw that Margaret had survived. His goal had been to eliminate her with that attack. "Not bad," murmured Luke, like someone watching a failed chess move. He realized Margaret had paid the price of her arm. Had she tried to save herself completely, she would have died. His blue eyes showed no pity, no respect, only technical evaluation. Margaret glared at him, blood poured from the place where her arm had been. "Bastard!" she muttered, her voice shaking with rage and pain. The battlefield froze for a moment upon Luke's arrival, giving Wednesday, Charles, and the others a much-needed break. Charles, still with blood on his face, collapsed to his knees as he felt Aldrich's psychic pressure vanish for a few seconds. The collective mental shield, which had required every ounce of his strength, was no longer needed, for now. "You arrived," he muttered through clenched teeth, a faint and relieved smile on his face. Enid, covered in dirt and with her fur torn, was panting as she got back up. She first looked at the young Wendigo's back. She had heard her name from Wednesday's calls with Luke, though only her voice. Then Enid's eyes met Luke's. Her heart began to race as she remembered what Wednesday had proposed. If Luke agreed, she could be with him again. Luke only looked at her for a second, just to make sure she was okay. Fortunately, Naira had arrived just in time. But for Enid, that second was enough, because she knew him. She knew that Luke, no matter how much he seemed like a cold sociopath, so much like Wednesday, did care about his people. Wednesday, still standing but exhausted, gazed at Luke's back with a mix of emotions: pride, relief, and quiet admiration. "Always so dramatic with your entrances," she murmured, never taking her eyes off him. Riene, still in her full wolf form, took advantage of the pause to tear apart one of the hooded figures and fling him against a tree trunk. Her claws were still dripping blood when she turned to face Luke. Even in her savage ferocity, she lowered her head slightly. Recognition. The Spellman twins looked at each other for a moment. They knew who had arrived, the nemesis of their family, the one everyone hated more than anyone else in the world. Still, they weren't stupid enough to think about attacking him themselves. They knew Luke's power rivaled their grandmother's or that of ancient demonic elders. They weren't his match and would die before even realizing it if they tried. "Well," muttered Vespera, her lips tightening just slightly, "so you're the famous heir of the Poes. Though you're the only living Poe," she added with a faint smile. Aldrich, for his part, never took his eyes off Luke. The grin on his face widened, as if he had just been introduced to a new and worthy opponent. Luke didn't answer right away. His sword remained lowered, resting in his right hand, the blade still faintly vibrating with accumulated telekinetic energy. His eyes slowly scanned the three Spellmans, one by one. Especially Alaric and Vespera. Judging by the power they radiated, they were clearly the leaders here. "So you're the infamous demonic Spellmans," Luke finally said, in a calm, almost disinterested tone, as if discussing the weather instead of a war between two ancient psychic bloodlines. "The renowned traitors who made deals with beings despised by all humanity. I suppose this is the first time I've spoken to one of you, at least at length," he added with a faint, mocking smile. "I didn't get that chance with Mortimer. I killed him faster than I expected, decrepit old man, with more rotten teeth than hairs on his head. We barely exchanged a few words before he was dead." The twins' eyes darkened. Margaret clenched her jaw. The two remaining hooded figures paled and took a step back. "But you too," Luke continued, with a hint of genuine curiosity. "You're different." His eyes paused on Vespera, then on Aldrich. Mortimer looked like a mummy pulled out of a sarcophagus that reeked of mold. You too, on the other hand, look like you just walked out of some high society party. If it weren't for the stench of sulfur, I might almost believe you were 30. Vespera raised an eyebrow, more amused than offended. "You're very calm," she said in a silky, almost maternal tone, though the tension in her gaze betrayed otherwise. "And you speak with great eloquence and confidence for a 16-year-old brat." Luke observed them in silence for a few seconds. Then he exhaled softly, as if realizing something obvious, and a crooked smile appeared on his lips. "I suppose it goes to your head," he said in a calm, almost conspiratorial voice, like he was confessing to a harmless prank. "When you kill so many supposedly powerful Spellmans, you start to take certain liberties with your tongue." Vespera let out a soft laugh, elegant and sharp at once. It wasn't mockery or contempt. It was recognition. She hadn't expected the last Poe to be like this. She hadn't expected someone so young to speak with the boldness of a veteran or to actually have legitimate reasons for it. "And do you really think you can win this fight?" she asked in a chillingly gentle voice. "Protect all of them. Your girlfriend," she added, her dark eyes flicking briefly toward Wednesday, the professors, an injured boy, and a wounded wolf. Luke stopped smiling. A look of mild surprise crossed his face. "Your confidence amazes me," he replied, his voice tired, as if correcting a childish mistake. "The real question is whether you will get out of here alive, or whether you'll be able to protect your own." He paused deliberately. His gaze swept over Margaret, now one-armed, breathing irregularly, then over the Spellman twins, barely keeping their composure in his presence, and finally landed on the two remaining hooded servants. One of them was trembling slightly. The other had his hands clenched as if in prayer. The Spellman servant had barely withstood Nyra's strike. "No offense," Luke added, in a tone that was equal parts sarcastic and lazy, "but if this is all you've got to throw at me, you might want to consider sending more demonic elders. Maybe Edward himself. Assuming he still dares leave his cave since 1840. A tense silence followed Luke's comment. Margaret clenched her teeth until her face twisted, not just from the pain of her lost arm, but from the humiliation implied, as if they were nothing more than flies to him. The Spellman twins, who barely 30 minutes ago had acted with the typical arrogance inherited from their bloodline, cold, mocking, sadistic, confident in their cruelty as a tool of dominance, took a step back in unison. An almost unconscious act. Their faces, once adorned with sneers of contempt and twisted amusement, were now pale. During that brief conversation, Luke's foresight had been running in the background. Several futures had unfolded in his mind. He could eliminate Margaret. He could fly a short distance and finish her in a second. His telekinetic flight speed was more than enough. A single direct slash would suffice, and the elderly woman with dual aura wouldn't even be able to react. But that wasn't the best path. If he did that, Vespera and Aldrich wouldn't try to stop him. On the contrary, they would exploit the moment. They'd launch an immediate assault on Wednesday and the others, just when they were most vulnerable. Charles was exhausted. Alecto severely wounded. Marlu's son could barely stand. Enid was still bleeding in her full wolf form. Even Rhiannon, though still strong, wasn't at 100%. The same went for Wednesday. So Luke chose the safer option. With a fluid motion, he raised Eclipse and struck. Telekinesis, condensed to its fullest from moments earlier, surged. The telekinetic blade emerged with a barely visible glow, almost ghostly, as if it were slicing not air but space itself. The first slash was for Margaret. An invisible wave, launched from a distance with surgical precision, shot across the blackened garden like a flying glass blade. The second slash came a breath later. This time, it split midair, dividing into two perfect paths aimed at the Spellman twins. His intent wasn't to kill them, not yet. As direct bloodline descendants of the Spellmans, it was unlikely they carried self-destruction mechanisms, poisons, or curses triggered upon capture. It was possible, but not certain. Luke would make sure to keep them alive. At the second slash, Aldrich and Vespera didn't wait any longer. The ground rumbled. A pressure, like an avalanche, crashed down upon the battlefield. Both advanced. Their movements weren't fueled by rage, but by controlled, devastating speed. As they charged, the air cracked. Each of them unleashed their psychic energy without restraint, over 30 tons of raw power each, wielded with the grace of those who had spent centuries refining their style. Both of them were heading straight for Luke. However, Luke had no intention of playing fair. "Shambles," he murmured with a slight smile. In a fraction of a second, he did it. He swapped the positions of his allies with dust particles in the air, microscopic, invisible to the human eye, but not to him. His clairvoyance and enhanced vision allowed him to perceive them. To the outside observer, It looked as if he had simply teleported. Naira and Alecto appeared midair, right in front of Aldrich. Enid and Rene emerged in front of Vespera. As for Wednesday, she was teleported directly in front of the two remaining hooded figures. Her dark hair fell with elegance, and her eyes glowed with cold intelligence as her dark scythe had already formed. Those two, traitors infiltrated from the council, were more valuable captured than dead. She knew that. The Spellman servant, tall and disfigured, barely had time to move. But it was already too late. The spatial distortion had been absolute. He couldn't react in time, and his chance to assist had vanished. Charles, meanwhile, was placed directly behind Luke, intentionally. He was the group's mental shield. Aldrich, besides being a physical monster, was a ruthless telepath. If anyone had to keep their minds protected, it was Charles, and Luke knew it. Marlowe's son wouldn't be of use. Luke teleported him next to the still-living body of his unconscious sister and sent them both outside the barrier to safety. They needed urgent care. As for their mother, Luke had already confirmed with regret that she wasn't breathing. Moving a corpse was pointless. All of this happened in less than a second. Luke joined the attack as well. He launched himself toward Vespera, ascending with a smooth motion but with slicing speed. He reached her first and struck with eclipse, imbued with 25 tons of pure telekinetic force, concentrated like a divine scalpel, guided by his 360-degree vision and mastery over the immediate future. The sword descended in a perfect arc. Vespera barely reacted in time. A shadow rose from her back, solid and dense, trying to shield her. But Eclipse cut through it anyway. The darkness was cleaved. The slash didn't decapitate her, but embedded deep into her left arm, severing it cleanly. Blood burst instantly, spraying into the air. A choked scream escaped her lips. "I'm on a streak of severed arms," thought Luke, watching as Vespera retreated at high speed. But Enid and Rene were already there to strike. Enid's claws came down like a storm upon Vespera, forcing her to raise a wall of shadows that barely withstood the blow. Rene entered from the right flank. She twisted midair and charged shoulder first into Vespera's small, feminine frame. Despite her high physical strength, Vespera took the hit at high speed. There was the sound of cracking ribs. She was sent flying, coughing up blood before crashing against a tree. Luke landed softly, spinning his sword with one hand and letting the blood stains slide off the blade. "I warned you," Luke said without raising his voice. From the rear, Charles watched everything with a mix of awe and cold analysis. The battlefield had changed. Before, they had barely been able to hold out. And now, with just one arrival, a single ally, the balance had completely shifted in their favor. Vespera lay wounded against a tree, her left arm severed and her ribs shattered. Wednesday had already taken down the two hooded figures. Their unconscious bodies lay on the ground, unable to even launch a final attack. Her scythe still pulsed with dark energy. Naira and Alecto hadn't injured Aldrich, but they had managed to hold him off. The Spellman twins, once mocking and cruel, had managed to defend against Luke's second slash, but not without injury. A red line marked one of their abdomens, and the other's thigh was bleeding. Margaret, for her part, was still standing, but barely. Luke's first strike had cost her an arm. The second had torn her side as it passed. Her body still stood, yes, but it was on the verge of collapse. The battle wasn't over yet, but the odds were now in their favor. A repulsive, wet, and unnatural sound erupted from Vespera's body. Her arm. It was growing. Where once there was only a bleeding stump, flesh began to bloom in reverse, as if time were compressing itself, accelerating regeneration. Bone, muscle, skin, all reconstructed in a matter of seconds. Her cracked ribs shifted back into place beneath her pale skin, and the blood, once gushing out, was reabsorbed as if the air itself refused to let her die. Enid and Rene came to an abrupt halt. Luke raised an eyebrow. "Interesting," he murmured. But it wasn't just the regeneration that caught his attention. There was a visible change. Vespera's icy, ethereal beauty vanished. The delicate features of a woman who looked no older than 30 suddenly withered. Her skin dulled, her cheekbones grew sharper. The veins in her hands bulged. Wrinkles carved deep lines across her forehead like trenches etched by force. She now looked like a woman in her 60s. The price of her regeneration had been time, a loan paid with youth, and perhaps with power. Luke didn't strike, not yet. Enid and Rene did. Both advanced with renewed ferocity, and this time they noticed the difference. Vespera was still strong, still wielded darkness skillfully, and her physical strength remained formidable. But something had diminished. Her reflexes, her pressure, her endurance, it was as if her body could no longer keep pace. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, Nyra and Alecto were fulfilling their task with flawless precision, keeping Aldrich busy. It was a titanic effort. Aldrich showed no signs of exhaustion, but he couldn't advance either. His momentum had been sealed in a tactical stalemate, and that was enough for now. Wednesday, who had already defeated 2 of the hooded figures and trapped them in shadow, now fixed her gaze on her old friends. She began walking toward them with firm steps. Anna and Jane Spellman. Dark mist coiled around her fingers, and her scythe still crackled as if yearning for a second dance. Anna and Jane had regrouped after barely dodging Luke's earlier attack. They were injured, but still standing. Margaret, seeing this, rushed to help her granddaughters, but had to defend herself immediately against an attack that would have torn off her arm had she reacted a second too late. Eclipse hovered in the air like a living blade. Damn Poe, thought Margaret. She realized Luke hadn't even tried to kill her, just to amputate her remaining arm. Wednesday wasted no time. This is for my scorpion, she whispered, as if she had been waiting years for this moment. Revenge. And then she attacked. The sisters fought. They struggled. They even managed to wound her superficially. But Wednesday was no longer the weak girl with a murdered pet. She was a genius, one far stronger than both of them combined. One of the most dangerous teenage outcasts, just like Luke, far above average for her age. Now that she no longer had to defend herself from Vespera or other attacks, fighting Anna and Jane felt like switching to easy mode. With a sweeping motion, she struck Anna in the chest with the scythe's handle, folding her like paper. Anna then took a spinning kick to the jaw, sending her reeling and knocking out several teeth. Bitch, Jane shouted, trying to summon her power, but before even a spark could ignite in her right hand, Wednesday sliced it clean off. Not the whole arm, just the hand. Before Jane could scream or her sister react, dark cords erupted from her own shadow and wrapped around her, slamming her to the ground. Sister, Anna cried out, about to lunge at Wednesday, but she couldn't move. Shadows were binding her limbs. What the? Anna thought, trying to struggle, but it was no use. Then black tendrils emerged beneath her, wrapping her tighter and tighter until she was forced to her knees, completely paralyzed. Wednesday approached and looked down at her with an icy gaze. She placed the blade of her scythe under Anna's chin, lifting her face to meet her eyes. If I had the time, I'd torture you until you begged me to end it, but lucky you. And with that, she punched Anna square in the jaw, knocking her unconscious. The Spellman twins, captured. Luke wasn't looking toward Wednesday, nor was he helping Enid and Rene. His attention was now locked on a tall, disfigured figure moving to assist the enemy. The Spellman servant. Over 2 meters tall, his face looked as if it had been torn off and sewn back on. One of those bodies that inspired fear just by existing, a nightmare to any normal person. He reminds me of the tyrant from Resident Evil, Luke thought as he headed toward him. He planned to fight him hand to hand. He raised his fists. He wasn't just trained in telekinesis, telepathy, and clairvoyance. His body now had the physical strength of 5 tons thanks to the awakening of his 4th aura. His muscles were denser, his speed sharper, his endurance greater. But that wasn't all. His fists were wrapped in telekinetic energy, not a diffuse aura, but compact spheres so dense they looked like liquid crystal. 25 tons of contained force. Each strike was a divine hammer. And besides, he always liked fighting this way. The servant roared and charged. Luke dodged the first strike effortlessly. His intense sensing alone was enough. He didn't even need to use his future vision. He struck the enemy in the stomach with his reinforced fist. A crunching sound echoed. The servant doubled over but didn't fall. Luke spun on his heel and delivered a second blow to the face. Jaw shattered. A low kick, reinforced with telekinesis and his physical strength. Knee broken. The servant collapsed sideways but was still alive, gasping, trying to move. Luke had no intention of dragging this out. He placed his hand over the bald head, fingers tightly gripping the deformed skull like he was holding disposable trash. The servant barely managed to lift his eyes. There was no plea in them, only the dark resignation of someone who knew this was the end. Luke clenched his grip. And then, with a swift twist of his wrist, he tore the head from the body like one opens a bottle, effortlessly. A brief spray of blood burst forth like a black flower in the air, hot and silent. The spine snapped with a wet crack, and the body collapsed without ceremony. The head remained suspended in Luke's hand for a moment, still frozen in a snarl of rage. Then he let go. It fell with a dull thud, bouncing once on the grass. "Tish," Luke muttered, wiping his hand on his pants as if brushing off some bothersome dust. The Spellman's servant hadn't lasted even a full minute against Luke. But even as he dispatched that threat, Luke never stopped controlling his sword. Eclipse was now teaming up with Wednesday, fighting Margaret. The Dualora psychic, now missing an arm, wounded and exhausted, was barely hanging on. Luke knew that between Eclipse and Wednesday, it was only a matter of seconds before they brought her down, and more importantly, captured her alive. She was a high-ranking Spellman, full of information that could be extracted, far too valuable to kill unnecessarily. However, his clairvoyance, a constant flow of possibilities, flickered with a brutal vision. Margaret, once overpowered and captured, was going to self-implode. A suicidal act, her last resort. Crazy old hag, Luke thought, frowning, and vanished in a flash. He propelled himself upward with telekinetic flight at impossible speed, and at the same time extended his telekinetic power. With it, he seized Margaret's body just before the energy inside her collapsed. Margaret, already on the verge of imploding, couldn't fight against Luke's telekinetic grip. To the sky, old woman, Luke thought, and hurled her. Margaret's one-armed body shot upward like a vertical projectile, piercing the sky in the blink of an eye. Barely a second later. Boom! A titanic explosion lit up the heavens as if the sun itself had erupted. The shockwave was visible for miles, forming a cloud of fire and black energy with violet edges, expanding slowly like an apocalyptic mushroom. Luke landed in front of Wednesday just before the blast reached them. He gently extended a hand and placed it around her waist to shield her. A telekinetic barrier unfolded around them like a perfect dome, protecting them from the searing wind. Wednesday looked at him. Luke looked back, straight into her eyes. "I missed you," Luke said softly, as if the battle had momentarily paused. Slowly, he raised his other hand and caressed her cheek. There was a cut, barely bleeding, a crimson line across her pale skin. A green shimmer ran along his fingers. The healing aura flowed, closing the wound as if it had never been there. Wednesday rolled her eyes subtly, but a faint smile, almost imperceptible, formed on her lips. "You shouldn't be saying that," she whispered. "There are still 2 demonic elders standing." "I know," Luke replied, unmoving. "But I missed you too," she added. She stood on her toes and kissed him. Behind them in the sky, the explosion still burned. The kiss was short but intense, not passionate, intimate. Wednesday pulled away first, just slightly. Her lips still parted, her breath quiet. In her eyes, the perpetual storm of her mind still raged, but for a moment, it seemed calm. Luke lowered his head slightly, resting his forehead against hers for an instant. Then a faint smile, the half-smirk that both annoyed and charmed her, curved on his lips. Wednesday saw it coming. "Don't say it," she warned in a dry tone. "I brought our daughter," Luke said anyway, with a calm, teasing, and yet strangely sincere voice. Wednesday closed her eyes for a second, not in affection, but in pure frustration. When she opened them again, they were sharp as blades. "She's not our daughter." "She calls us Mom and Dad," Luke replied, raising his eyebrows slightly. "And I brought her to fight, so technically it's a family activity." "Luke," said Wednesday, with a coldness that could freeze the air, "you're using a battle against two demonic elders to reinforce a parenthood narrative that doesn't exist." "Hey, don't say that in front of the kid. It'll hurt her feelings," Luke said with a regretful expression. Wednesday shot him a deadly glare, then she sighed. In the distance, the roar of a new impact echoed through broken trees and darkness. Aldrich was still standing, so was Vespera. But the battlefield had changed. It was far more manageable. "We'll have this conversation later," she declared, turning with elegance to return to the fight. Luke watched her walk away, a look of both pride and love in his eyes. Eclipse flew back to his hand, tracing a curve in the air like a sharp, loyal shadow. He caught it effortlessly, like the weapon and its master were one. His expression, which moments before had been warm, softened by Wednesday's presence, shifted instantly. The loving gaze vanished, replaced by a cold gleam in his eyes. His lips curved slightly. "Let's finish this," murmured Luke. Vespera spat blood onto the blackened ground, the shadow still pulsating around her body like a restless veil. Her eyes, once cold and calculating, now burned with a primal fury. She had lost an arm and recovered it at a high cost, her youth and a part of her power. And now Margaret was dead, a powerful double-aura psychic from her family. The other two girls had been captured. The same went for the hooded ones, and the servant had been decapitated like a mere doll. All of this because of one person. Her gaze landed on Luke Poe, who stood several meters away with Wednesday. With a powerful blast of darkness, Vespera threw off Enid and Rhiannon, who had to leap backward. "Aldrich," Vespera shouted, her voice resonating with brutal, inhuman intensity. "Go, warn Edward. Tell them what this boy can do. Tell them Luke Poe is no longer a theoretical threat." Aldrich didn't respond. His calculating gaze lingered on the scene for a few seconds more. Enemies surrounded them. Vespera was cornered. Luke, without a single visible wound, was already approaching, unstoppable. His decision was immediate. The dome above the Marlowe estate vanished. Then Aldrich turned toward Naira, who barely stood in his way, and delivered a brutal kick. The Wendigo girl barely managed to cross her arms in an X before she was flung like a dry leaf in a gale. Alecto, wasting no time, tried to stop him. Her Gorgon eyes lit up with a glowing green hue, trying to paralyze him. But Aldrich never looked at her. He clapped. A simple clap. The air trembled with the shockwave. 40 tons of force shook the field like thunder. Alecto was thrown backward, dragged by the impact. And then he flew. Aldrich took off at a tremendous speed, without farewells, without looking back. Wednesday turned to Luke, the scythe already formed in her hand. Her hair, tousled from the battle, fell over her shoulders. The cut on her cheek healed. Her gaze burned with an icy fire. "Go," Wednesday ordered firmly. "Don't let him escape. Hurt him if you must. We'll handle this damned hag." Luke paused for less than a second. He didn't know Wednesday like this. It was the first time he'd heard her give an order in that tone. So commanding, so general-like. It was a different side. A far cry from the Wednesday with the cold gaze, sharp remarks, and piercing silences. That voice, though still controlled, had risen in volume, a tone of command. It wasn't anger, it was authority, dominion. And, for some reason, he loved it. A crooked smile briefly crossed his lips. An almost treacherous impulse tempted him to say something. But it wasn't the moment. He simply bowed his head, a silent gesture of acknowledgement. He looked at her one last time, knowing he was leaving her with a berserker fury like Vespera's, but they couldn't let another demonic elder escape when they had the chance to wound or kill him. Luke barely turned his face toward Charles, who was already watching him. No words were needed. Charles nodded once. Luke raised a hand, and with an almost imperceptible gesture, enveloped him in his telekinesis. Both ascended instantly, shooting off in pursuit of Aldrich, who, to Luke's surprise, could fly as well. But he didn't seem to control telekinesis. Otherwise, he would have used it in the fight like Margaret. He merely seemed to possess the ability to fly, a power obtained through some shady deal with demons, most likely. Vespera knew she couldn't stop Luke and Charles, especially not with 5 bloodthirsty enemies before her. Darkness began to pour from her back, tentacles, wings of shadow, black spikes sprouting from her spine. Her body trembled with spasms, as if something greater than her was trying to burst out from within. Her skin tightened, her hair turned white, her face aged even more, but her power increased. The air grew heavy, and the ground beneath her began to crack. The smell of sulfur and rot filled the air. But Wednesday and the others weren't afraid. They didn't back down. They began to close in. The young Wendigo stepped slightly forward, her glowing red eyes burning with primal intensity. Her mouth, larger than normal, held long fangs that protruded even when closed, as if her wild nature could never be fully hidden. She smiled. A macabre, eager smile. "I can smell your fear," Naira murmured, more to herself than to Vespera. "I wonder what you'll taste like cooked." Wednesday said nothing. She didn't scold her. This was no time for sermons. Charles Faulkner flew through the gusts, his body suspended by Luke's telekinesis, the young man he had once taught, and who now was dragging him on a mission far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. Charles kept his eyes open, not out of physical necessity, but because he needed to clearly see what was happening. Not for the first time since they had launched after Aldrich, he reflected on how absurd and miraculous the situation truly was. From a critical, nearly hopeless situation to a complete reversal, now the elder Spellmans were fleeing with their tails between their legs. All the other enemies either dead or captured. All because of one person. Charles looked at his student. Just about 2 years ago, he was the quietest, antisocial, almost feral, always in the back as if even breathing near others annoyed him, he thought. And it was true. When young Luke had started his first year at Nevermore, he barely spoke beyond what was strictly necessary. If anyone tried to get close, he wasn't kind, he drove them away. And yet now Luke had allies. He had a circle. He had Enid in his first year, something that astonished many. The most cheerful, exuberant girl werewolf in the entire school had fallen for him. For a while, Charles thought, the light had managed to balance the shadow. That relationship didn't last. They broke up at the end of first year. And the following year, Wednesday Addams arrived at Nevermore, colder than Luke, sharper, more distant. A soul as dark as a winter night, but with a brilliant edge to her intellect. 2 antisocial, grumpy, sarcastic individuals in different ways, clearly bonded by a shared taste for the macabre. Charles had watched them grow closer. It was slow at first, almost nothing. They barely spoke, as if both were too proud to start a conversation, no matter how simple. Then he learned they had joined forces over the mystery of the Jericho murders. And that slowly brought them together, until the first blood moon, when it was clear that feelings had started to form. Charles still remembered the raven dance, when Wednesday stood up in her black dress and walked over to Luke to kiss him in front of everyone. They ended up being the most talked-about pair of the night, and also crowned king and queen. Now they were chasing a demonic elder, likely over 150 years old, or close to it, and Charles knew what his role was. Luke only wanted support, protection for his mind, because no matter how strong Luke was, his mastery of the blue aura was still young, still penetrable. And Charles would not allow any spellman, no matter how cunning or ancient, to touch even a corner of his student's mind. The air shifted. Charles had barely enough time to react when he felt it. Luke released his sword. Eclipse shot from his hand like lightning. The blade carved a glowing arc through the air, a trail of fire tearing across the sky. Its speed was impossible to follow with the naked eye. Aldrich, flying a few hundred meters ahead, sensed it. He didn't see it. He didn't hear it. He felt it. Pure instinct. He twisted his body, diving downward just in time before the blade reached him. Eclipse's edge grazed his side, slicing the air with a sonic boom. But Luke was no longer beside Charles. His strange teleportation technique, Charles thought. Luke reappeared above Aldrich. At the tip of his index finger spun an orb, a condensed telekinetic core. It vibrated. It crackled, like a star forcibly compacted. Luke hurled the orb. The Spellman sorcerer barely had time to raise a barrier. It wasn't enough. The blast didn't strike him directly, but the shockwave sent him flying. His body flipped multiple times before crashing into the forest, shattering branches, smashing through trunks, and finally crashing into the earth, forming a crater around him. Charles landed gently, still wrapped in Luke's telekinesis. He touched down a few meters from the smoking crater where Aldrich's body lay among rubble and dust. Luke, in contrast, descended without hurry, without urgency, as if he already knew the outcome. Eclipse had not returned to his hand. The sword floated across the clearing, suspended like a sentinel awaiting a silent command. From his position, Charles watched young Poe advance toward the crater. 4 auras. 4. That alone was already an anomaly. A psychic with 3 auras was a prodigy, something seen only once every, 200 years. The oldest psychic families were lucky to have 1 or 2 such users in their entire bloodline. A psychic with 4 simply didn't exist, until Luke. At least, not in the history of outcast beings in the United States. The first aura Luke mastered was the yellow one, and without a doubt, it remained his central pillar. But thanks to his clairvoyance, he had become even more effective. That ability to foresee, combined with his precise control of telekinetic waves, allowed him to attack and move with an efficiency no other marginato possessed. He wasted no energy. Every movement was calculated with surgical economy. That's why he stood there without panting, without his stamina on the verge of collapse despite everything he had done. Using his teleportation technique multiple times, flying at absurd speeds, attacking with Eclipse repeatedly, and more. Of course, part of the explanation lay in his 4th aura, the green one. Charles, as a close ally of the Addams family, already knew. The healing aura. An aura that not only allowed the user to heal themselves and others, but also to optimize metabolism, reduce cellular fatigue, and regulate internal functions. An aura of constant regeneration. And naturally, it enhanced base strength, endurance, and speed. Now add to that the blue aura, and the Poe soul weapon that turned every strike into a lethal one. The perfect war machine. Luke stopped when Aldrich emerged from the crater. The distance between them was about 10 meters. Aldrich looked at him, then noticed Eclipse floating behind him, about 20 meters away, ready to strike if he tried to flee. Then his gaze returned to Luke. Regeneration in exchange for years of youth, Luke asked aloud. He had noticed that Aldrich bore no wounds despite taking the full blast of the telekinetic orb. But with eyes trained to see even dust particles, Luke could tell that Aldrich's skin looked older. Not as dramatically aged as Vespera's had been when she regenerated her arm, aging visibly by 20 or 30 years. But here, it was like he had aged 5. And since Aldrich had no intention of replying, Luke moved without warning. He shot forward like an arrow, the air roaring around him. His fist already wrapped in telekinetic waves. 30 tons of combined force between his green aura and the telekinesis enveloping his punch. And yet, the deadliest part wasn't the power, it was the precision. With his foresight active, he had already seen the exact spot where Aldrich would try to dodge. There was no escape. Luke's fist slammed into the old man's face with a muffled boom. A direct blow to the jaw, powerful and brutal. Aldrich's head snapped to the side violently from the force of the strike. but not without consequence. Because, like a veteran, he had anticipated he couldn't avoid it. Instead of defending or fleeing, he counterattacked at the very moment of impact. His fist rose at the perfect angle, aimed directly at Luke's face. But Luke had seen that too, and at the last moment, just a blink before contact, he turned his head. The blow didn't land fully, but the friction of the airwave, combined with the pressure of Aldrich's fist, was enough to slice open his cheek. A line of blood ran down his face, from his ear to the corner of his mouth. Not deep, but it hurt, and it bled, a lot. Aldrich, on the other hand, was sent flying backward like a bullet. His body spun midair, but he managed to land on his feet, sliding several meters along the ground before stopping with a crunch of dirt. A small cloud of dust rose around him. Aldrich spat blood. His nose was broken, but within seconds the bones began to regenerate. His physical strength is around 40 tons, maybe slightly more, Luke thought. If he fought using only his telekinesis wrapped around his fists combined with his physical power, Luke could reach about 30 tons. Clearly, it would take a while to bring him down, though with his clairvoyance, he could aim for vulnerable points. Plus, he could launch telekinetic orbs with explosions that caused both external and internal damage. However, that's where Eclipse came in. Each slash channeled his telekinesis, sharpening it. Each strike cut through matter as if it were air. Its speed was supersonic, its trajectory flawless, its lethality unquestionable. And added to all that, Luke's clairvoyant precision. Aldrich looked at Luke. Something surprised him. Luke wiped the blood from his cheek with the back of his hand, and in that moment, the wound began to close, healing from the inside out. In just a few seconds, his skin was good as new, smooth, and unblemished. "What?" Aldrich asked aloud, his eyes wide. For the first time, his expression showed genuine surprise. Luke gave him a smug, silent smile. "What's wrong?" he said, in a tone so calm it bordered on mocking. "Did you really think you were the only ones who could regenerate? Though luckily, I won't be aging in the process." He didn't even finish the sentence. Eclipse moved. Taking advantage of Aldrich's shock at discovering Luke possessed a fourth aura, something that would stun anyone who heard of it. The battle continued. Aldrich tried to dominate Luke's mind from the very first move. Illusory traps, subtle invasions, psychic attacks that would have shattered the mind of any normal telepath or any outcast without mental defenses. But Luke was protected. Not just by his own defenses through his blue aura, but also by Charles, who remained at a safe distance, reinforcing Luke's mental barriers like an invisible fortress. Together, they formed an unbreakable shield. The elder spellman was rendered useless in the realm of mind attacks, which was precisely why Luke had brought his professor with him. Aldrich had only his physical strength and flight left. But Luke didn't need to match him in raw power. He surpassed him in everything else. Speed, clairvoyance, precision, versatility, energy optimized by the green aura, technique, and eclipse. The sword flew, struck, sliced, withdrew, charged again, shifted angles, appeared where it was least expected. Luke used his shambles like a deadly dance, appearing in front, behind, above, at the sides, without any predictable pattern. Every strike was a kill attempt. Aldrich held on. He was strong. His regenerated body gave him endurance, but his barriers were useless against Eclipse. His strength helped him defend, not win. The pressure was total, and where he was truly an expert, it served him no purpose at all. Luke struck his side once. Another time he slashed his thigh, then his shoulder. Little by little, he wore him down. Until Luke saw the final opening. Aldrich stepped back, exhaled. His body turned just half a second slower. And that was all Luke needed. Eclipse shot forward, vibrating through the air like a black streak, propelled by telekinesis. The sword pierced straight through Aldrich's chest, side to side. The impact stopped him cold. Aldrich staggered a step, looked down. The blade had entered through his left side, passed through his heart, and exited cleanly out his back. One arm dropped lifelessly, Blood spilled from his mouth. And just in case, Luke appeared beside him, Eclipse already in hand and cut. Aldrich's head spun through the air like a fallen crown. The body, now lifeless, collapsed slowly. Charles watched everything with a furrowed brow and a vein pulsing at his temple. His forehead was covered in sweat, his face tense. Though the battle had lasted only 5 minutes, shielding Luke's mind from a psychic like Aldrich had been an exhausting task. And that was with Luke being a telepath himself. If he weren't, Charles thought as he knelt on the ground to catch his breath, this would have been impossible. Luke, on the other hand, was breathing steadily. No gasps, no tremors, but the sweat on his brow and the latent aura flickering around his body betrayed the considerable energy he'd spent since arriving here. Even so, he could keep fighting. In past battles, he'd been in far worse situations. This was just some sweat and spent energy from using his abilities and strength. Charles watched him approach. His steps were slow, steady, as if there were no doubt in him. Eclipse floated behind him, returning to his back, awaiting its master's hand. "Are you all right?" Luke asked bluntly, seeing Charles on his knees. Charles looked up at him. He nodded, though it was still hard to speak. He inhaled deeply, "I'm all right." His voice sounded a little broken, not out of weakness, but from sheer exhaustion. He still felt the pressure in his temples, the lingering echo of mental assaults, and the walls he'd raised inside his mind throughout the entire fight. Luke extended a hand. Charles looked at it for a moment, then accepted. Luke helped him up. Even after engaging in close combat with one of the most dangerous psychics of the century, he still had the strength to lift his professor. "Thanks," Luke said simply, directly. "If you hadn't been there, this would have been a lot harder." As Charles stood, he looked at him with a mixture of fear, pride, and relief. Not fear of Luke as a person, but of what he was. A 16-year-old psychic from an ancient bloodline with 4 auras. A soul weapon capable of cutting through any material or defense effortlessly. A clairvoyant mind that could see seconds into the future, with a domain so vast it worked like a 360-degree radar. Telekinesis that, once matured, would be unstoppable. He already had an absurd level for his age, although, of course, compared to monsters like Mortimer or Margaret, both over 70, he was still a step behind in raw telekinetic power. But that was only natural. Then came the regeneration, one that mocked death itself. And physical strength still developing, yet destined to one day match, with nothing but his body alone, the might of werewolves, vampires, or the strongest outcast beings in terms of strength, speed, and agility. He also possessed a blue aura, mental powers, telepathy, illusions, mental defenses, sensory manipulation. All that in a 16-year-old. No weaknesses. Strength, speed, foresight, healing, mind power, clairvoyance, a soul weapon and an ancient lineage coursing through his veins. Without a doubt, Luke was already part of the elite in the outcast world. And not elite because of wealth, politics, or influence, purely because of power. Still, danger hadn't disappeared. There were more Spellman demon elders who hadn't yet shown themselves. And the most feared of all, Edward Spellman. According to records, he died in 1900 at the age of 101. But clearly, that was a lie. Considering he was born in 1799, he was now just a few years shy of turning 250. It was impossible to know exactly how much power he had accumulated over all this time. But one thing was clear, facing him head-on would be a grave mistake for anyone on the council's side. Edward had once been a double-aura prodigy, just like Edgar Allan Poe. And now, he had likely made pacts with demons to further enhance his strength. Other elders might be even more powerful than Aldrich, Mortimer, or Vespera. But the living had their own monsters. On Luke's side stood Titans, Gomez Adams, Fester Adams, Stalin Umbrio, beasts among the outcasts. Still, Charles knew that Luke was growing, and growing fast. In 10 years, what would his level be? Who could stop him? He'll be the strongest psychic of all, Charles thought, watching as Luke calmly wiped the blood from Eclipse. No, he'll be the strongest outcast in the world. At that moment, a sound tore through the sky. The air distorted, the pressure shifted, and before Charles could even react, he felt something arrive. Luke turned his head sharply, but it was already too late. From nothing, from a cloud of distorted particles, a creature burst forth, vomited out from the very abyss of time and space. It hadn't been detected by Luke's domain because it hadn't come from anywhere nearby. It had teleported from thousands of kilometers away, or perhaps from another plane entirely. A massive creature, seemingly made of liquid flesh and solid smoke. A grotesque face with no visible eyes and a gaping mouth that took up more than half its head. From its back floated chunks of formless mass, and it descended directly over the spot where Aldrich's corpse lay. Its mouth opened wider than nature should allow. A demon, Luke thought, startled by the sudden arrival. In one swift movement, it devoured Aldrich's body whole. The severed head, the arm, the rest, everything. Luke was already in motion. His hand gripped Eclipse. In a fraction of a second, a telekinetic blast, like a blade of compressed wind, shot forward. The arc of energy curved through the air, aiming straight for the creature. But the demon, with a dry, ripping crack that sliced through the atmosphere like paper, it vanished. The blast grazed one of the floating chunks of flesh, tearing off a portion. The demon shrieked, a hideous, bone-chilling sound. And then silence. "What was that? A demon?" Charles asked, not expecting an answer. "Yeah," Luke said, frowning, uncertainty flickering across his face for the first time. Why had it taken the body? When he killed Mortimer, also a demon elder, nothing like this had happened. No demon appeared. No one came for the remains. Why now? Then again, he had turned Mortimer into a sphere of blood rather quickly. Was this the Spellman's doing, reclaiming their own? Or was it the demons? If it's the demons, maybe they want them back to feed on, to reclaim what's theirs or something like that, Luke thought, a trace of urgency tightening in his chest. He turned to Charles. "I'm going to the others," he said, and vanished. He shot into the night sky, a supersonic flash slicing through the darkness. Within seconds, he reached the Marlowe estate. There, in the middle of a crater, lay Vespera's corpse. Her body was sprawled at the center of the pit, wounds covering her torso and face. There was no trace left of the beauty she once possessed. What lay there now was a deformed crone over a century old, wrinkled, sunken, drained. Her flesh torn open, her skin lacerated by slashes, bites, and darkness. Her head was severed, resting beside her decrepit form. Luke descended slowly, scanning the area with his senses. Wednesday was standing. Injured but steady, dried blood on her arm, a mark on her forehead. She breathed through her mouth, her gaze fixed on Vespera's body, as if waiting for it to rise again, for the head to reattach somehow. She still held her scythe in one hand. Riene, the professor, had a deep wound in her thigh and another on her side. Her clothes were in tatters, her body drenched in blood, both hers and someone else's. Enid was near her. Her arm was dislocated, her jaw swollen, claw marks tearing down her back. Even so, her expression was alert, though her legs trembled beneath her. Naira lay on the ground a few meters away, resting on the grass with her arms behind her head, using her small hands as a pillow. She was injured, yes, but her face showed no pain. Just something strange, like the peace that comes after a good fight to the death. She was gazing up at the night sky. Alecto, the Gorgon professor, was sitting against a rock. Her breathing was heavy and uneven. She had an open wound on her side and another, more serious one, in her right eye, which she kept closed, blood trickling down her cheek. Her gaze was steady, but drained. Luke landed softly beside Wednesday. Without wasting a second, he extended his hand and pulled Vespera's body toward them, head included. If that demon showed up again, it would have to get closer to him, and it wouldn't escape so easily this time. "What are you doing?" Wednesday asked, watching the corpse now lying just a few feet away. "Aldrich is dead, but that wasn't the end," Luke replied. A demon appeared, swallowed him whole, and vanished. I don't want the same thing happening to Vespera. I wounded it, but it disappeared instantly. Maybe it returned to the demonic plane, or maybe it works with the Spellmans. But that didn't happen when I killed Mortimer, so it might try the same thing with her, he added. Wednesday nodded slowly, surprised, though no emotion showed on her face. Then let's not leave her body here, Wednesday said coldly, staring at Vespera's corpse. Turn her into a blood sphere, just in case. It's useless to us now. Better to make sure it's useless to everyone. Luke didn't argue. He extended his hand, and in less than 5 seconds, Vespera's body was reduced to an unshaped sphere of compacted flesh, blood, and bone, about the size of a football. "Dad!" cried a sweet but slightly hurt voice. Luke turned, just in time to see Naira spring to her feet with surprising agility. Despite a cut on her pale leg that made her limp slightly, she ran toward him with disturbingly cheerful energy. Her smile was far too wide, so wide that any normal child would give someone nightmares. Her red eyes gleamed. Sharp teeth peeked from between lips twisted in brutal joy. 2 horns protruded from her head, and her long, bony fingers with sharp nails clutched tightly onto Luke's torso as she hugged him. "I had a great fight," she said with wild excitement. "I tore a chunk of skin off that old hag. It was awesome. And I even told Mom she was already dead. I smelled it. But she still kept her guard up and didn't believe me." Wednesday's brow furrowed slightly. She said nothing. But that Mom stuck in her mind like a thorn. Luke noticed the expression. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and then he accepted Naira's hug with ease, wrapping one arm around her while his other hand affectionately stroked one of her horns. "You need to understand something, Naira," Luke said, glancing sideways at Wednesday with a faint, mocking smile. "Your mother is paranoid." Wednesday clicked her tongue. "Looks like you spoiled her too much during training," she said in a cold voice. "This is what happens when you think you're a babysitter." Luke gave her a soft, almost defiant smile. He didn't reply. Instead, he crouched down in front of Naira and placed his palm over her injured leg. The energy of his green aura flowed like a strand of emerald light, slowly healing the deep gash. Though Naira had accelerated regeneration due to her Wendigo nature, that cut must have hurt, even if she didn't show it, because she wasn't normal, because she was fierce, and her brutality felt like a game to her. Wednesday watched him. Luke Poe kneeling beside Naira, his hand on her wounded leg, letting the green aura flow calmly, as if it were something as natural as breathing. She felt a pang of surprise because she knew Luke better than anyone. Yes, better even than Enid. Enid knew a lot about Luke, what annoyed him, what he liked, his personality. But she hadn't lived beside him the way Wednesday had, at Adam's Manor, in Shadowside and beyond. She knew how hard it was for Luke to open up, to show affection. Just like her. And now she saw him like this with Naira, someone he'd only known for a few months, someone he'd adopted by chance. This wasn't just compassion, or a sense of duty. It was real affection, without irony, without distance. Naira, that little girl with wild instincts and sharp teeth, that Wendigo who could tear a man apart with her bare hands, had achieved something few ever could. She had entered Luke's heart without forcing her way in. And now, watching Luke like this, healing so effortlessly, Wednesday couldn't help but think of something else. A flicker of the future, one where the war was over, where they had won. A future where Luke wasn't just healing Naira, but someone else. Their real children. Wednesday looked away for a moment. Then Luke stood up. He walked toward her, calm and steady. "What are you thinking about, Commander?" he asked, noticing something strange in her eyes. As he spoke, he gently brushed away a strand of blood-matted black hair that had fallen across her forehead. Wednesday looked at him. "Nothing," she answered curtly as always, but this time her tone lacked its usual edge. It was just control. When Luke reached out to heal her, Wednesday stopped him firmly, grabbing his wrist with one hand. "No, others are worse off. Electo has a destroyed eye. Riene is covered in wounds and has lost a lot of blood. The Marlowe girl is still unconscious, and her brother looks pale. Give them first aid if you still have energy. We need to stay alert. Luke stared at her for a second longer, hesitating, but he understood there were higher priorities. He nodded and turned away, heading first toward the Marlowe girl, who was clearly in the worst condition. Meanwhile, Wednesday turned to Naira. You. Yes, Mom. Wednesday's brow twitched slightly, but she didn't correct her. She knew it was a lost cause. Go over there, Wednesday said, pointing toward the captured Spellman twins and the unconscious hooded figures. Keep an eye on them. Naira looked at them, clearly unimpressed with the assignment. Watch them. Boring. Wednesday simply raised an eyebrow. Okay, I'm going, Naira grumbled, quickly moving toward the prisoners. After that, Wednesday looked toward Enid, who was still in her werewolf form. Enid began walking toward the Marlowe house, not looking back. Wednesday knew why. If Enid returned to her human form in front of Luke, she would be naked, and she surely didn't want that, not out of distrust but probably out of shame. Even though she was still hopelessly in love with him, even though obsession still flickered in her eyes whenever she watched him, it had been a long time since they were together. And Luke didn't know what they had discussed. That Wednesday had offered her something unthinkable, a polyamorous relationship. Because Enid was her only friend, and because they both loved him. Enid had accepted, with surprise, joy, and hope that Luke would say yes. But they hadn't spoken to him about it yet. The mission had come right after. The trap, the battle. Wednesday walked slowly after her, crossing the field. When she entered the Marlowe house, she saw Enid step out of a room, back in human form, wrapped in a blanket that covered her entire body. Her blonde hair messy, with blue and pink streaks matted with sweat and blood. Her body wrapped in a threadbare blanket she had taken from inside, clinging to her like an improvised towel. Several wounds still marked her skin, some not fully closed. Wednesday watched her in silence for a moment. Then she spoke direct but soft. You're hurt. Come with me. Let Luke heal you. Enid hesitated. Her gaze dropped for a moment, nervous, but she nodded. Thanks, Enid murmured, following Wednesday. They walked together back to the group. Both of them knew it wasn't the right time to tell Luke about the polyamory. Not yet, but soon. Very soon. Luke had just finished closing an open wound on Riene's side. With one final motion of his palm, the green glow of his aura sealed the flesh and dissolved the clotted blood. Thanks, Riene whispered, sitting up with difficulty. Luke gave a slight nod, already on his feet, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Damn it, being a healer sucks, he thought. Healing wounds wasn't exactly easy. It required a lot of energy, and after the battle he had just gone through, his reserves were far from optimal. That's when he felt them, or rather when he saw them. Enid and Wednesday, side by side. A combination that, months ago, would have seemed absurd to him. His ex-girlfriend, the girl who had been his first love, still with damp hair, blood from the battle on her skin, and a ragged blanket draped over her body. And beside her, his current girlfriend, his partner, his soulmate in this world. Wednesday Adams. It was Wednesday who approached first, direct as always. She's hurt, she said without drama. Heal her, please. Her black eyes didn't plead, but neither did they command. There was something different in her tone, a subtle note of concern, barely perceptible. Luke raised an eyebrow, more surprised by the pair than by the request itself. The last time he knew for certain that Wednesday and Enid had fought together was in Sunnyvale, when they faced Gabriel Spellman. Enid had shown up there because Wednesday had told her the location. Why had she done that? Because she had seen a vision of Enid dying and wanted it to happen. But in the end, she saved her. Luke never got the full explanation for that change of heart. Wednesday never told him. He could only assume that she wasn't a cold-blooded killer and realized that jealousy, or the fact that Enid was still in love with him, wasn't a good enough reason to let her die. If Enid was still in love with him, at least up until Sunnyvale, she was. She wanted to help him. Luke had no idea how the hell she could still have feelings for him after their last serious conversation, when he told her he wouldn't keep his promise and that he had chosen to be with Wednesday. That day, Enid had slapped him and called him a bastard who didn't keep his word. And yet, she followed him to Sunnyvale, risking her life to help him. After that, Luke hadn't seen or spoken to Enid again. It was as if she had suddenly given up on chasing him. He'd started his training, and Wednesday resumed the school year at Nevermore. During some video calls with Wednesday from Nevermore, he had heard pop music playing in the background. Too bright, too cheerful, nothing Wednesday would tolerate for more than 5 seconds. Which led him to guess that she was sharing a room with Enid again, even if she didn't say so, and he didn't ask. He knew Wednesday went on nighttime missions with trusted allies. Professors like Charles, Renee, and capable students like Xavier, Ajax, or Veronica, whose loyalty wasn't in question. Enid, it wouldn't be far-fetched to think she was part of that group too. She had been with them in Sunnyvale. She had risked her life. If Wednesday accepted her as a battle partner, it meant she trusted her. And if they were roommates again? If they were doing missions together? It was obvious something had changed between them during those months. He had spent training like a maniac, isolated from the world. Did they become friends again? Luke wondered, now seeing them together, and Wednesday asking him to heal her with a hint of concern in her voice. He knew Wednesday, better than anyone. He knew she had never had a real friend, not a female one at least. The only person who might fit the friend category was Eugene, the Blue Aura kid who controlled bees. But that was more of a sibling bond. She protected him like a younger brother. Enid was different, and if he hadn't gotten in the way, if Wednesday hadn't fallen in love with him, they probably would have ended up as friends. Maybe they were, at first. After all, when Wednesday first arrived at Nevermore, he and she didn't start their relationship right away. Months went by before they fell in love. And during that time, it's possible Wednesday and Enid shared more than he ever knew. But then his relationship with Wednesday deepened, after everything with the blood moon, the murders, the hide. The bond with Enid broke, for obvious reasons. "Hi, Luke," said Enid with a faint smile. Her voice barely trembled. The dried blood on her temples contrasted with the warm tone she still managed to keep. Luke didn't answer right away. He just looked at her. Then he looked at Wednesday. She held his gaze, steady, unflinching, as if that silent exchange of looks was saying, "Yes, I'm the one asking you to do this." "Hi, Enid. Sit down," Luke said. Enid obeyed, lowering herself carefully and sitting on the grass. Then she pulled out her right arm, showing deep wounds and jagged lacerations. For a moment, Luke's brow furrowed slightly. "That psychic really tried everything to kill us," Enid explained, noticing his expression. "Yeah, I figured," Luke murmured. Enid's a close-range fighter, so she took the worst of it. Plus, she had to cover for Naira more than once because of her reckless attacks, Wednesday added. Luke glanced at her, then looked toward Naira a few meters away. That girl, he thought. He placed his palm a few centimeters above Enid's wound and began to heal her. He finished healing her arm. Enid let out a breath of relief as the pain faded. She flexed her fingers, testing for stiffness. There was none. "Thanks," Enid whispered. "You're welcome," Luke replied, still looking at her. "But I doubt that's the only injury." Enid tensed, as if she'd been expecting that line. "I have a cut on my right side," she murmured, lowering her gaze. "But all I have covering me is this blanket. You know, when I go back to human form, my clothes." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Luke already understood. Wednesday, standing behind her, crossed her arms. She said nothing, didn't intervene. But Luke glanced at her briefly, almost by instinct, looking for some kind of signal on her face. Jealousy, a warning, a silent one, "Touch her and I'll rip your arms off." But he found none of that, only calm. Luke looked away and let out a quiet sigh, without drama. "All right, I'll close my eyes. I'll use my clairvoyance to see your wounds," he explained in a low voice. "It's like a kind of X-ray. If I keep my eyes shut, I won't see any details, just energy, nothing that should make you feel uncomfortable. Okay, Enid nodded. Luke closed his eyes, and Enid slightly opened the blanket. He extended his right hand toward her, aiming precisely at the location of the cut. Enid held her breath for a moment, but the touch never came. There was no physical contact, only the sensation of energy wrapping around her. Warm, healing. After a few minutes, the wound was fully closed. Luke withdrew his hand, and Enid quickly covered herself again. Done, Luke said as he stood up. Thanks again, Enid whispered. It's nothing, Luke replied, giving a small nod. Wednesday was still there, unmoving. Calm, her arms still crossed, her face a mask of perfect control. Luke straightened up completely and gave Enid a small nod, indicating she could rest. Then he walked toward Wednesday with measured steps, but something in his gaze had changed. Something inquisitive. All good? He asked in a low voice once he was in front of her. Wednesday looked at him directly, without hesitation. Yes, she answered with absolute calm. But Luke knew her. That answer wasn't enough. There was something more. He had felt it since the moment he saw her appear beside Enid. Luke gave a small nod, though he wasn't convinced. He took one more step and said in a lighter tone, All right, now you're the only one left. Without giving her time to protest, he slipped an arm around her waist and pulled her gently toward him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Wednesday looked at him, serious but not surprised. Her hands remained still, resting lightly against his chest. No, she said, not softly but not harshly either. It's not necessary. Luke raised an eyebrow, still holding her. My injuries, while not minor, aren't serious. You've already spent too much energy during the fight, and now healing everyone, Wednesday explained in her usual clinical tone. Luke frowned slightly, as if he were about to object. But before he could say anything, Wednesday added, Besides, the reinforcements have arrived. Luke turned his head slightly, and then he saw them. In truth, he had already sensed them for a while with his domain. Larissa, the head mistress of Nevermore, was leading the group, accompanied by several teachers. Coach Vlad, Mr. Fitz, the pale Isadora Capri, and a handful of Nevermore students. He instantly recognized Xavier and Ajax, his two best friends. Also there were Veronica, his cousin, walking alongside her inseparable friend Daphne. Bianca, Yoko, Davina, Ken, now, Eugene, even Pugsley Adams, which made him raise an eyebrow slightly. The reinforcements Charles had requested via telepathy. Took them long enough, said Luke, still holding Wednesday by the waist. The battle had already ended several minutes ago, and Charles had probably sent the distress call easily 30 minutes earlier. Though maybe, after Luke arrived and turned the tide, Charles told them not to rush, that things were under control. Not everyone has supersonic speed, Wednesday replied, barely turning her head toward him. Luke gave a slight smile. Wednesday tried to slip away discreetly. She didn't want to make a scene in front of everyone, but Luke didn't let her go. He pulled her a little closer, calmly, and murmured, I healed everyone but my girlfriend. What would your father say if he found out about this? Wednesday glared at him for a second, though a tiny twitch at the corner of her lips betrayed the truth. Most likely, Wednesday said flatly, he'd write you a cheesy poem, or a 10-page letter about how important it is to care for love. Right, and he'd probably disown me from the respect I worked so hard to earn while we trained. That I couldn't handle, Luke added, mock grave. Wednesday exhaled softly, a mix of annoyance and resignation. Do it quickly and without any ridiculous displays. When have I ever made ridiculous displays? Luke asked, already channeling green aura into his palm. Wednesday didn't answer. While Luke was healing Wednesday, Electo, Riene, and Charles, who had arrived after being dropped off by Luke, explained the whole situation. The trap, those involved, the arrested criminals. Larissa, the professors, and the others were surprised to see that everything had already been stabilized and that they had actually won against two demonic elders and Margaret Spellman, who wielded two auras. All eyes turned to Luke in the distance, still in front of Wednesday, applying healing energy with an unusually tender touch. Most of the newcomers hadn't seen Luke in months. The last time they did, he had already been powerful, yes, but now, even at a glance, he was different. Taller, more defined, his posture firmer, his movements sharper, his presence heavier. Then the rumors about his fourth aura are true. That sword at his side, is that the Poe weapon? Larissa began organizing the group, ordering that the captives be taken to a safe place so they could get information from the twins and identify the hooded figures. Professors and students started moving according to her orders, but some didn't take long to break formation. Among them, two figures who disregarded protocol without even trying to hide it. "Luke," Ajax shouted, walking briskly toward him, followed by Xavier. "Finally seeing you in person, bro," Xavier added with a wide smile. "How many demons did you have to slice in half before they let you finish training?" Luke stood up, still holding Wednesday's hand for a second longer before letting go. He gave a faint smile as he saw them. "Ajax, Xavier," he greeted with a touch of genuine warmth rare for him. "It's been months." "Only online, playing LOL or Call of Duty," Ajax replied with a smile. "And even then, you barely logged in anymore. You said you were training, but you didn't say you were turning into a damn psychic tank." Xavier looked him over with a raised eyebrow. "Your aura feels heavier, and the body too. Is that from the green one?" Luke nodded. "Strength, metabolism, recovery, muscle structure. It's like living in permanent enhancer mode." "That explains the arms," Ajax muttered, feigning jealousy. "Can I touch them?" he asked, glancing at Wednesday. "No," Wednesday answered before Luke could. Her tone was dry, sharp, as if the question had been offensive. Ajax froze in place, hands up like he'd just triggered a laser alarm. "Whoa, okay," he said, stepping back half a pace with a nervous smile. "Noted. And just to be clear, it was purely scientific male curiosity. You know, who's got the bigger bicep? Nothing weird." Xavier let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Luke watched them with a half-smile, then turned his gaze back to Wednesday, raising an eyebrow. Her expression remained firm, as if she genuinely didn't see what was so funny. "Protecting my biceps now, from Ajax, a friend," Luke thought. It was just a casual comment, a lifelong gym bro joke. And yet, Wednesday had reacted as if someone had tried to unbutton her shirt in public. In contrast, earlier, when he healed Enid. When he had to get close, when she opened the blanket, vulnerable, wounded, and he touched her, even if only with his aura, so close in silence. Not a word. No sharp look. Not even a raised brow. Strange, Luke thought, growing increasingly suspicious. After greeting everyone, Eugene, Pugsley, Yoko, Veronica, it was time to return to Nevermore. The distance was about 300 kilometers. For Luke, a matter of minutes flying at supersonic speed, but he chose not to. Instead, he decided to go with the group. Escort the criminals, make sure there were no surprises on the way, but also to enjoy the moment, to be with his friends, to hear their jokes, to see them in person after so many months, and of course to walk beside Wednesday. An hour later, they arrived at Nevermore. The grand gate activated upon detecting the group's auras, and the school doors opened as if they had been waiting for their return. The criminals were taken to the dungeons, where hides who couldn't control themselves had once been held, under extreme security and escort. Luke would also keep his domain active over them. He wouldn't let them escape, or somehow slip away or attempt suicide. "Shall we?" said Ajax, with the excitement of someone about to share a room with his friend again after a year. "Yeah, let's go. I want to see my old room," Luke replied, exhaling deeply. Xavier was already a few steps ahead, joking about which movie or video game they should play and how they'd spend all night gaming. But just as Luke was about to follow them, a voice stopped him. "Luke," said Wednesday behind him, with that dry, decisive tone that allowed no room for avoidance. "We need to talk." He turned slowly. He looked at her, She was perfectly calm, but there was something in her eyes. Not cold, not distant. Precise, like someone who had just made an irreversible decision. It took Luke a second to respond. Now. Now, Wednesday repeated, without breaking eye contact. Ajax and Xavier paused a few steps ahead when they heard her. They looked at each other, and Ajax let out a low whistle with a nervous smile. "You better go with her," said Xavier, patting him on the shoulder. "We don't want to see you get frozen alive by a stair." "Or worse, stabbed or something," added Ajax, laughing. "Good luck. I'll pray at your grave if you don't come back," joked Xavier, giving him a double thumbs up. Luke let out a breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," he muttered, before nodding and turning toward Wednesday. She had already turned around, walking down the stone hallway without checking to see if he was following. Thanks for watching this episode. Like, share, and follow for more interesting stories and narrations. Thanks a lot.